All right, everybody, here we go. We're going to be talking on the genetic evidence of Genesis and evolution as well. I'm trying to enlarge this as much as possible. There we go. So before I jump into the technical stuff, let's talk about some things that I want to cover for Christians that are watching. Like, what is going on with the young earth creation? Why does it have any relevance to this? And I like to ask them a question back in return. When we look at this genealogies going back, where do these people stop becoming real people? That's what you need to ask yourself. If this is a lineage and you trust that Jesus is real and that Abraham is real, where do you give up on that? Where do you give up on Noah? Do you give up on David? Do you give up on Adam? Because really, we can't do that, right? Jesus said he died for the sins of Adam. So what's going on? Why do so many people today say, oh, it's not really a true story? We don't have to take it literal. It could be allegorical. Well, even historians that are against the Bible literally admit that Old Testament has always taught that it's been a literal version. The global flood, worldwide, literal, 6 days of creation, literal. And then we have people arguing all the time that, well, it was just James Ussher that really was the first one to ever do this. And nobody believed like him before that period. And that people today only use his arguments, and it's more of a modern day thing. But actually, if we look into history, we find that people have been doing that with the book of Genesis for a really long time. Matter of fact, it starts in 240 AD. That's not far after Jesus himself, that people were using the genealogical chronologies to determine the age of the earth and the age of humanity based on Adam. And if you go back to Adam and there's 6 literal days, well, that takes us back to creation. And a lot of people go, well, you know, what about the Jewish people? Well, they also believed in young earth creation, and they only changed their mind because of the theory of evolution recently. We can even look at their calendars to prove this. Guess what? Their calendars still reflect a young earth. This is the year that they believe that it is. 1 year behind, actually. I need to update that. But nonetheless, the theologians came along and they said, well, I guess we're just going to have to accept what the modern day science is saying because we can't refute this. So we're going to obviously have to change scripture. We're not going to have to learn the science, God forbid. We're actually just going to change our beliefs around because that's what we have to do. But there's a problem when you do that, because in order to say, it's, we can be creationists, but we can believe in evolution. We really can't do that because nothing makes sense. It's still contradictory. You have the Big Bang. Nothing about the book of Genesis goes along with it. It doesn't match anywhere. So if it doesn't match, what did the church do? Well, the Catholic Church was the first one to actually come up with the Big Bang idea. So they just said, well, we'll just abandon the literal view and we'll just say it's all allegorical, the entire thing. Why not, right? I mean, why not just accept evolution? Well, here's why. Because if we look into history, we actually find that it comes from pagan ideas first. These ideas aren't new, really. They're scientifically new ideas, but they're pagan in origin, and they go really far back. Matter of fact, it wasn't that people thought the Earth was old all the time. Matter of fact, it was only just a little while ago in the 1700s that somebody actually questioned it and said it's more than a few thousand years old. And it was James Hudson who brought in uniformitarianism. But besides radiometric dating, what was there? There was nothing that said that the age of the earth was old. Nothing. So they have to have deep time. You see, they need it because it makes the impossible possible. Therefore, they can just say, we can just say that the days were really, really old. We can invoke that there's some evolution. Just add time, and time becomes everything. It makes everything possible because you don't need evidence. You can just say, well, add enough time. That's what did it. And for the critics out there, we already know that they don't question anything. We've already experienced that. Okay, so for the Christian, it comes down to not whether or not you have to be a young earth creationist to believe to be saved. It's just the foundation of what scripture is actually saying. And is it really true? Is God's word true? Is it a literal thing that we can trust? And we're going to go over the evidence of that today. But before we do, we have to talk about what is science, what is falsifiable, what is making testable predictions. How did Darwin come up with this idea? Is it really scientific? So we're going to jump into those things right now.
If we look at Charles Lyell, his goal was in secret anyway. This is what they found in his journals later. His goal was to free the sciences of Moses. And the Bible actually predicted him a long time ago, believe it or not, because he said the present is the key to the past. The Bible actually tells us that in the last days, people will believe the earth is continued as it was from the beginning. That's literally uniformitarianism, the very thing he pushed and what everyone believes today, which is just a pagan theory of evolution to begin with. He actually took this idea that there's three fundamental human types. There's the whites and the yellow people and then the black people, all related to the chimpanzee, the orangutan, and the gorilla. And he said, if we push this agenda as far as we can go, we could prove that men came from the orangutan. So you notice what he did. He literally pushed this hidden agenda, and he said, let's see, now I got to get people to believe this. Now I got to get them suckered into it. So what did he do? He went to the Niagara Falls. He went there and he started to catalog it, and he started conversing with people that lived there, as one of them in particular, which was a local geologist. And he said, how much do you think the water is eroding at that area? And the guy said, probably around 3 feet a year. What did he do? He went back and said, that's too fast. I'm going to slow it down. And I'm just going to say that it erodes at 1 foot a year. And I'm not going to tell anybody. I'm not going to tell anybody the math because he didn't run any. He's not going to tell anybody about any of his science because he didn't have any. He just made it up and he lied to the public. And then later, the very scientist came along and said, why did he publish that? Because now we know it actually rose about 5 feet a year. And it's completely the opposite of what he wrote because he wanted to push the date back. You see, the Creation Ministries International, Dr. Henry Morse, said that Lyell did this to make the uniformitarianism age 35,000 years for the falls. So his goal and agenda to lying to the public was to get people to drop the Bible, which again takes you back to his first goal, was to free the sciences of Moses. He hated God, like a lot of people do today, and they need evolution to be true. So they just make up this story. They follow the story, no matter if it was a liar. And then they defend the liar. That's what's shocking to me, Donnie, is they'll defend this guy who literally made these things up and lied to them because they want to defend their belief.
This brings us to the next part, and that is that scientific theories must make testable predictions. And what strengthens a theory is whether or not these testable predictions come true or not. If they do not, the theory is now falsified. The real battle is over the exact same evidence. We view it one way, they view it another. But why do they view it this way? Their interpretation is that everything goes back in time for millions of years. This is the debate. Which one is true? Evolution or creation? You see, in Darwin's day, there were 3 camps of creationists. There were the young earth creationists, known as biblical literists, who are us and still exist today. There were the old earth creationists, or day-agers, gap theorists, intelligent design, and theistic evolutionists as we call them today. Then there were the non-literalists, or allegorical or symbolic genesis interpretationists, very similar to how Catholics are today. Many of them were theistic naturalists. So in Darwin's day, the majority of people believed in the non-literal version of Genesis, where the flood of Noah never happened, and God created species as they were, where they were. This is what Darwin focused his attention on by refuting and attacking the non-literal biblical view, such as the Catholics hold today, which of course he ended up proving wrong, thus winning the war of mainstream biblical creation versus his new theory of evolution, which states that animals can adapt and change in new environments. People just didn't know. He only refuted a very strange version of the non-literal Genesis way of thinking. This idea all began long before him, but by Darwin's day, it was established and very popular. And this is where the story leads to him going to the Galapagos Islands, which were colonized in the late 1800s. The tortoises once thrived in the archipelago, where there were originally 15 species on the islands. However, since the arrival of people and the introduction of numerous feral animals, 4 species have become extinct.
Darwin wrote about the harvesting of the species of tortoise only found on one of the islands, which was exterminated within 15 years of his visit to the Galapagos in 1835. Darwin predicted that within the next few decades, each species would go extinct and be gone forever. Since evolution is so slow, there is no way it could save them. He believed this because he trusted that deep time evolution was true and that speciation was a slow process. Because of this, he believed that the different tortoises on different islands could not mate with one another, as they have been separated over just too much time. Darwin believed that the Galapagos Islands broke off from South America millions of years before and isolated the tortoises, each to their own island. What do we know today? Well, recent genetic research has shown us that the tortoises are related to one another and can still breed with one another. And what he thought was extinct was not extinct. And that the species he thought were completely extinct actually were still living on today, and their genetics were mixed in with the other ancestry. Today, there are 13 tortoise species in the Galapagos, with more hybrids being discovered all the time. Darwin's predictions based on deep time evolution being true failed yet again. Darwin was right about the role of natural selection in producing varieties of tortoises, however, but he claimed that it disproved the mainstream biblical view of creation, as he personally believed in this non-literal theistic concept of Genesis, which held to a creation event known as fixity of species. Meaning he believed that God created the earth kind of how it is, and that since there was no global flood where animals got off the ark, diversified, and rapidly filled the earth, that never happened. And since many Christians in his generation also had abandoned the idea of a literal global flood, they were easily convinced and fell away from the faith. People like Darwin never considered the what if it was a literal story. A pair of related species got off the ark and adapted to new environments. That's literally what it says happened in Scripture, and what creationists would have believed if they took Genesis as literal. To those who believed the Bible is real history, including all creatures having to repopulate the earth from one location, it would have been a completely consistent finding. The church's allegorical view of Genesis gave Darwin an easy straw man argument to knock down. So did Darwin really debunk a literal creation model of Genesis? Not even close. You can learn more about these sea tortoises on different islands from Creation Ministries International's stunning Darwinian documentary called The Voyage That Shook the World. We view things very differently than the evolutionist. We talk about rapid adaptation to environments. There's recombination, gene conversion, chromosome fusions, and epigenetic adaptation. These and possible mutations which can inhibit genes influence the tortoises and why they look different from island to island, but are yet all recently related to one another. And if deep time was true, the evolutionists would be right and they would not be able to mate with one another. And their genetics would show massive amounts of genetic dissimilarity. And yet, what do we find within related species worldwide? Genetic similarity, the exact opposite of what was expected to be found, which led evolutionists to make another retrodiction that a global bottleneck must have happened in the past, completely contradictory to what they had said earlier. And here's an image of one of the oldest tortoise fossils on Earth, hardly any difference from those alive today. But a lot of people ask, Darwin was a pioneer. And yes, he was wrong on things, but he got the most important thing of all right, which is natural selection. And that's true, isn't it? Well, I have bad news for you on that front as well, because he plagiarized that from other people. That's right. Darwin plagiarized it mostly from Edward Blyth, which was a biblical creationist. And we know Darwin stole his ideas because they had communications with one another. And Darwin not only took use of his ideas in work, but even special words that had never been used before, that were invented by Blyth to describe things, now made it into Darwin's book. But he did not just plagiarize him. Oh no, he took the idea as well from other people and mixed it in. This study, which was done at Trent University, discovered that without Patrick Matthew, the origin of species would have never been written. For Darwin took his ideas and also retrofitted them in, expanding on Edward Blyth. Darwin was nothing but a plagiarizer. So his most famous voyage, and looking at tortoises, is great proof of biblical creation and a complete falsification of evolution. So yes, Darwin got his ideas of deep time from those before him, One of his biggest influencers, besides his grandfather Erasmus, was a trained lawyer by the name of Charles Lyell. He popularized uniformitarianism, the idea that all things have continued as they are now over time. Does that remind you of anything? It should. It's actually a biblical prophecy about the last days, which states almost exactly what people would believe in these days, stating, all things will continue as they were from the beginning of creation. So by Lyell's single phrase, the present is the key to the past, he just disqualified any catastrophic event in Earth's history, including a global flood, because he argued that we can only interpret the past through the lens of what we see happening now, today. This is why the education system does not talk about catastrophism, and why it's also still frowned upon all these years later. This is precisely what Lyell did. With his one short phrase, the present is the key to the past, he automatically ruled out a historic global flood from the picture without ever mentioning it. He replaced history with his made-up version of it, adding eons of time to the past without any biblical history at all. And this is an excellent legal tactic, as you know he was a lawyer. But is this really scientific? Not at all. It's the opposite of science. It's actually pseudoscience made up of lies, then backed by an agenda and disguised as science, but I digress. His comment about the present is the key to the past is purely anti-science. It rules out any possible alternatives for the reason why things are the way they are, because you are not allowed to consider anything other than what we see happening today. That is literally the definition of a dogmatic cult thinking. It's literally putting blinders on scientists and telling them anyone who disagrees or thinks about anything else other than this, that they are wrong, no matter what evidence is presented. This is the modern day basis for the belief of deep time and slow, gradual geologic processes. He is the reason the masses believe in the fossil record and millions of years today. It's not because the science proved anything like it, and certainly not because it's true. Lyell stated in one of his letters in his journals that was found after he died that his goal was to free the sciences of Moses. That was his agenda. It was all based on a lie. And Charles Darwin, at age 22, fresh out of school, brought only a few books with him. One of them was Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. And one of the things that Lyell said was that if he were to push this as far as it could go, that he could prove that men came from the orangutan. And right after that, what was pushed so heavily in 1924? That's right, there were 3 fundamental human types, the white, the yellow, and the black, all related to their own primate species. The Asian, the orangutan, the black, the gorilla, and the Caucasians related to the chimpanzee. Charles Lyell, with his lies, influencing the science yet again, all these years later. So before the 1800s, we have Hudson's book, The Theory of the Earth, published in 1795, that made people doubt the Earth was young. And then we have Lyell's book, The Principles of Geology, which made people doubt Noah's flood. And then we have Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, which attacked a straw man argument of the fixity of species that was believed by people that did not even believe the biblical creation story was true. And he made people doubt the Creator. These 3 people influenced all of science that we believe today. And Charles Darwin is related to the Rockefellers. And today, they fund the public school education system. And they are notorious for saying that they do not want a nation of thinkers. They want a nation of workers. And they know that the people will believe whatever the media tells them to believe. And evolution is pumped out to kids and adults on a constant rate. And they admit that even if all of the data pointed to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. So when you're not looking for something, you will never find it, and then they'll claim that there's no evidence for it. Let that sink in. Another problem that we have is atheistic evolutionists today have incentive for doing what they're doing. They also don't want to feel as though they've wasted their life. Not only have they gone through the entire school believing something, that would look really foolish of them to actually now admit that they were duped and fell for a lie, but then they actually paid to learn more of it in college. So that's money down the drain. So not only do they have time and money invested into this, But then they start teaching others. Then they have to admit to those others what they taught them was a foolish lie as well. That puts them in the sunk cost fallacy. It's the phenomenon whereby a person is reluctant to abandon their strategy or course of action because they have already invested heavily into it, even when it's clear that they should abandon it because it would be more beneficial to them. They just cannot do it.
So these are the subjects that we're going to at least try to cover today. This is my intent anyway. And we're going to go down the list and we're going to show why creation is so superior to evolution compared to predictions that were made versus predictions that were falsified. And the first one we're going to get into is genetic similarity. Now, a lot of people know that today evolution uses genetic similarity as their best evidence for evolution. But the reality is this is the exact opposite of what they predicted. You see, in 1963, Ernest Mayr, an evolutionist, said that if deep time is actually true, that genetic dissimilarity would be what we see, because what will happen is over time, genetics will be too scrambled up and things will be so diverse that there will be no genetic relation when we look at things. And a young earth creationist in 1975 said the exact opposite, said no, a common designer, a common creator would create everything that would have similar everything inside of them. And we should see those similarities. So because of that, when we look in the genome, we're going to expect to find genetic similarity, the exact opposite predictions. And so now we have, before any of the genetics was actually ever tested, we have testable predictions made by each side. Which one ended up being true? Well, it was inescapable and stunning, as they put it on evolutionist side, that genetic similarity is actually extremely high. And this is not what they expected. This is why they had to invent a genetic global bottleneck with all of life, because to them, they were correct. Evolution, that is right. The mutation rate is so high that if deep time was true, it would have separated everything genetically by so much, nothing would be even remotely close to looking related. What did we find? We found exactly what young earth creation predicted. And our model, as you guys know on this channel, if you're new here, you're going to learn that our model predicts that we share genetic similarity based on function. What do we know today? Well, guess what? Genes are now being predicted based on their function when we look at sequences. So when we read a sequence inside the DNA, we can go, oh, look, that's a telomere. Oh, look, there's another sequence. What one's that? Oh, that looks more like it's satellite DNA. Oh, look at this one. That one's unique. What does that go to? Oh, it's a different part of the genome altogether. It's an orphan gene. So we're being able to identify different sequences, different sentences, and those sentences tell us what functions they have inside the body. So now, why do we share genetic similarity with something that a young earth creationist would say we're not related to? Because when we look at these things, we see a high number, right? It's like, whoa, 98%. That's pretty odd. So what would happen if we looked at the phylogenetic inheritance showing genetic relation? Okay, we got humans related, we get Neanderthals, and then all of a sudden, we jump down into chimpanzees and then gorillas and then a pig for some reason and then an orangutan, right? It's like, what in the world? Pig before that one? That's interesting. So what's going on? Like, why do we have this? It's like, why would a pig be in there? And how come they have so much genetic similarity? Are we related to pigs more than we are the orangutan and the pongo? Because when we look at that, we see that is true. The orangutan is about the same as the pig. So therefore, they try to strengthen this argument by going, well, that's true. You know, we do share genetic similarity, but we got to look at homology as well. So therefore, this is what they say.
You know what? I never noticed this, but my pet bat has the same number of fingers as my pet alligator. Isn't that a quinky-dink? One of the main arguments Darwin used for his theory was that of homology, these odd similarities between very different animals. Why would they be so similar unless they were related?
So it makes sense, right? It's like, wow, we have a hands, and then we look over at a chimpanzee, they got hands. It's like, well, you know, then we look at a lizard, they have hands. With frogs have little hands, all 5 fingers. Oh, you must share a common ancestor, right? But, you know, we started the genetic evidence started conflicting with what the evolutionists were looking at when they started comparing the molecular analysis with the physiological evidence. right? They noticed that there was a flaw when they looked at the orangutans. They go, why? It's like, why? They were noticing that the homology structure was different than the molecular data. And they got upset about this. They said there is no theory holding that molecular similarity necessarily implies an evolutionary relationship. It's like, wait, what? That's all you guys are saying is the best evidence for it. So they're implying that homology is actually better. So the molecular data that contradicts the idea of genetic similarity denotes relation is often dismissed. So they're saying like, okay, well, homology seems to line up better, but we're going to get rid of that because genetic similarity is better evidence for us. And Nathaniel Jensen, as you know, who wrote Replacing Darwin, said we will be able to know better relation if we had judged this not on just molecular data, but functional data, right? So evolutionists came along and they were like, well, you know, how do we know what's related and what isn't? Okay, so we as young Earth creationists, we use the mitochondrial DNA, the autosomal DNA, and the Y chromosome DNA. Why? Because they are traced in a linear pattern directly to what is related, right? And we can follow this back in time to a single person. Evolutionists don't do that. Did you know that? When they build their phylogenetic charts, they don't look at the observable evidence. They infer it. They actually base it on something entirely different. And these are protein coding genes, which I'm going to get into. These aren't paternity tests, which show relation. They're entirely something else. So that's why I said we like to follow the direct line of evidence that can follow something. So when Jensen, as you know, is saying that these functional differences are what we see, we can come along and say, now, why is there genetic similarity even in these protein coding genes? Well, because we view function as something different. If we line up cytochrome C, which is something that they like doing, which is a protein coding gene, and they go, look, we can now build the phylogenetic charts using this area of the genome, this protein coding gene. This is really good. So now they build their chart. Well, they can't actually compare it to other parts of the genome by comparing something like cytochrome C because it builds entirely different charts. So they have to narrow down and cherry pick and look at particular types of data sets and ignore everything else. As where we can just take the data that comes from what we know to be true following the direct lineages, and we know that there is no phylogenetic chart at all. And we base this on function. That's why we share some protein coding sequences with other things. Take why we would share more genetic protein coding genes with a chimpanzee, like rather than a frog. It's because of how we also grow our hands, right? A human hand looks like a web. And as we mature in the womb, that web disappears between the fingers. So this is a functional role of that protein coding gene determining how we are built. So it's a function based on not only what the structure looks like, but how that structure forms. It's a functional difference. As where a frog, they grow their fingers out from the base, out from the root. So therefore, now we have reason on why these functional differences exist and why they make any type of pattern at all. And also why they refute one another and why they stick to that. And here's another short clip. I'll give you another example to break up the monotony of just listening to me.
If you look at different creatures' DNA, the rule of thumb is the more similar, the more closely related, and vice versa. Biologists expected to see a gradual branching path of DNA mutations from species to species, and they did find some success. Take, for instance, this little guy. He's a gene called cytochrome C. You can find a version of him in such places as your handsome or beautiful self, chimpanzees, dogs, moths, even yeast. He's one of the most commonly sequenced portions of DNA, so it's a great test case to see if the similarities hold up and point toward common ancestry. So, if we compare your cute little cytochrome C to this ugly, hairy chimpanzee cytochrome C, they look exactly alike. Weird. With dogs, there's about 90% similarity, moths, about 2/3 similar, and yeast, only about half similarity. Wow, just what we'd expect. These results must be really strong evidence of common ancestry. Whoa, no, who let you in here? Shoo, get out of here. Meet cytochrome B. He's a lot like C, except he likes to throw monkey wrenches into Darwin's expectations. He's just one example of many. If Darwinism is true, we should be able to construct a reasonably consistent family tree, pretty much no matter what genes we compare. But that's far from the case. In reality, using genes like cytochrome C as evidence for common ancestry is just a good example of molecular cherry picking. Depending on what genes are used, biologists will come up with wildly different ancestry and contradictory trees of life. Comparing different animals' cytochrome B genes, scientists found cats and whales cavorting in the primate club, kicking poor little cute little tarsiers out into the cold, frogs and birds and fish carrying on together in their own strange little group, and even sea urchins masquerading as chordates. It's madness!
As you can see, they can only build their phylogenetic trees and their charts if they choose to only look at one particular region. They can't compare other things with it because it destroys the rest of the trees. They can't make any phylogenetic tree of evolution because they all contradict one another. That's because it is not true. So when we look at, for example, superoxide dismutase, another metabolic enzyme, and we compare it to another protein inside the human body, another dissimilarity shows. They don't coalesce. They don't link together. That's why a lot of these college books like Tree Thinking and Evolution 101, which are college books, don't even attempt to try to show any common ancestor to anything. They said our knowledge of molecular processes is not good enough to definitively rule out independent origins. As a creationist, that's exactly what we would expect, right? But they admit that in their books because they know that they can't prove anything, because every time they try to look at a particular region, it shuts the other prediction down. It disassociates it. It's not true. That's why they can't build it. And I made a book to go along with this so anybody can later follow along or get the book just to pass out, things like that. So, quote from somebody says, genetics has no proof of evolution. It has trouble explaining it. The closer one looks at the evidence for evolution, the less one finds of any substance. In fact, the theory keeps on postulating evidence and failing to find it. It moves on to other postulations like missing links, natural selection, positive mutations. It's just not science, right? It's just throwing out. It's inference, saying, just look over here, right? But what do we know? We know that when it comes to predictions, that's what makes a theory strong, and that's what falsifies another theory. This shows the strength that the best evidence for evolution is literally what we predicted, and they U-turned it, they wheeled it, they changed it, and made it evidence for them when it's not. So never let anybody ever tell you that the best evidence for evolution is genetic similarity, because it's cherry-picked nonsense, lies, and the genetic evidence that does show any type of relation, like why do we have even some type of resemblance to it at all, just shows that a common designer, because it's based on function. So it is the reason that we would see something, and it was not predicted at all by evolution. Why? Because a programmer doesn't start from scratch each time he develops a new program. Instead, he uses the same general command that he uses for other projects. It shows the creator's efficiency and integrity, right? So if we as creationists, we could have easily been falsified. We could have looked in the genome of animals, and we could have seen multiple strange sequences. We could have found like an alphabet in English in one, and then find a binary mathematical sequence in something else, and then something else over here. And we would have been in big trouble, because that would make it look more like there were, if we wanted to still hold to intelligent design, we would have to say that, well, maybe there's multiple designers. Maybe there isn't one God. Maybe there's multiple designers that created life. See, we would be in big trouble. But the fact that we do see so much similarity, and it all shows the exact pattern, it shows that there is only one designer in all life, because he used the same program, the same code. Why would a programmer use a different source code for every piece of software rather than use the same framework and language for each application? It only makes sense. And look at God's creation. Look at Look at how the regulatory network for E. coli is compared to the Linux operating system. God's design is superior than everything we can even make today. And design is everywhere. I know there's people like Godless Engineer out there and other atheists that deny this, but literally the biologists, the atheist community's geneticists themselves admit that this is true. Here's an example of that.
Is the genetic code really a code? It is a code. It's definitely a code. But nevertheless, there is no problem in saying that DNA would be a code in just the same kind of way as a computer code. It certainly is a code. You can read it as a code. You could even transcribe. I think I put this in River Out of Eden. You could even transcribe a book into DNA letters, and you could read it out again. You could preserve it in DNA. That's how code-like it is. It really is completely code-like code. A digital code is merely quaternary rather than binary.
We've shown that DNA is actually the software of life. It's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world.
The DNA code itself is so digital, is so almost exactly like a computer tape.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created." Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart. The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be. So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from? Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a program? Materialists think so, through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution.
So yeah, when we look at the language of life that we see inside the human body, we see a language, a hierarchical pattern that describes a literal code, and it's everywhere. When we look at, they even use actually linguistic rules when we talk about genes. We talk about transcription. There's editase when we edit a gene. It's everywhere around us. So the evolutionists, they have a lot of problems because they want to ignore this type of data and just say, it's all by chance. Well, you can believe that all you want, but this is why Scripture made it very clear and very simple that God gave us creation so that we would know that there is a creator, so that no one is without excuse. So it's very, very simple. And when we go into the molecular data, and we look at different forms of life, and we're trying to build this hypothetical imaginary tree of life, there's inconsistencies because they're trying to use different forms of evidence to build and construct their phylogenetic trees. And one of those things is homology. But when we look at molecular data, it would show that rhinos are actually closer to hedgehogs than they are to elephants, which are obviously look much more similar. So they have to invent things like convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is when things cross pattern, then they gather the same type of physical appearance and look, even though they're not related. They came to the conclusion that they got this way through convergent evolution over time. That's why a shark and a dolphin would have the same fins, for example. So how did eyes evolve? Well, for them, these evolved because of convergent evolution, but they have to admit, they're so different, they're so highly complex, they arise out of nowhere. Maybe there is an independent origin, because when we look into the what they used to say, well, look at that, the eye must have evolved 50 to 100 different times. When has anybody at any time ever seen any experiment produce the formation of any eye, even at any point? It would have to evolve the Hox gene to begin with. It would have to now create mutations that aren't harmful at all, because anytime you throw a mutation in the Hox gene, the PAX6 gene, which constructs eyes, it causes horrible problems, usually blindness. So how can random mutations that are more often than not harmful create eyes? Well, convergent evolution. Therefore, it only has to do it once and then pass it on, right? How about bats and dolphins? Did you know that they say they're related? That's right, convergent evolution, because they have similarities, because they have lived similar lives. What are they talking about? How do bats and dolphins have similar lives? They don't have any similar life at all. They live in literally the exact opposite conditions. One lives only in the water. The other one lives only in land. How in the world can they say that they share similarities because of their environment? They don't share the same environment. How about milk? They know that mammals like cats and dogs, they produce milk, right? But did you know there's also ants that produce milk? That doesn't make any sense, right? No big deal for the evolution, right? Just throw in convergent evolution, right? It's no big deal. Makes no sense, right? It's just a rescue device. It's there to throw in things that don't make any sense. How about the baculum bone that's in all primates, but they say, wait a minute, humans are apes too. Oh yeah, well, we're missing that bone. Where is that in the fossil record? Just showing oh man, we just lost this vital reproductive bone and then grew an entirely new organ. Where's the evidence for that? There is none. None. How about flight? That's right. Flight evolved over 7 different times in evolutionary history in literally every different field that there is. Like, I'm sorry, grouping of animal, right? We have mammals, we have aquatic species, like in fish, we have birds, bats, we have insects, flight's everywhere. But what do we actually see? We see loss of flight. We don't see anything's gaining the ability to fly. Look at how many times loss of flight has actually occurred. What's that about, right? We're seeing loss of flight all over the place. We don't see things learning to fly. We don't see like, wait a minute, this thing has a little tiny wing, and then we investigate it. We go, oh yeah, it lost its ability to fly. We don't see anything going to flight. So it's just this imaginary scenario that they invent to help them through the fact that they don't have evidence, because what we see is the exact opposite. That brings us into the next one. Creation would predict that we would only see one genetic line going back to single people of the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. But evolution predicted that there were multiple people every single time you go back to a bottleneck in history. There were at least, they say, 10,000 women and 10,000 men over 200,000 years ago, right? But like, what's going on? They say, these are the first pioneers of people. They didn't look much like us. They kind of did, but they were more primitive in features. We say, no. We go back to Noah with the Y chromosome, but you can trace everybody back to Adam and Eve, right? That's one of the things that we should be able to do. We are able to find a genetic sequence that we can trace back to single people, not groups of people. Because if you assume that there were 10,000 women or 10,000 men, then we should see multiple lines of that evidence inside of people today, but we just don't see it. We don't see this scenario of a bottleneck 200,000 years ago, or even the other one of 74,000 years ago in the genetics. That's not there. What we do see is the biblical ancestry, where we find people going back very recently in time to a Tower of Babel event where there was dispersion and massive population growth. And genetic similarity between all humans is really, really, really low. And that can't really be based on how fast the mutation rate is and based on how everybody is related to one another. But what is if you type in, you go, look at this, there is only one descendant that we all came from in both male and female. That wasn't what they expected, but it's exactly what the biblical model would have said. And they admit that we can safely say that with fair scientific certainty, that every man alive today descended from one man, and every human alive today descended from one woman. And it is exactly what our model predicted. And that is not an evolutionary idea that would have ever been predicted, especially in regards to, as a matter of fact, that's why they mocked the idea of biblical creation to begin with, because they when they named mitochondrial Adam and mitochondrial Eve, it was kind of a laughing at the creation, as saying, ha ha, you guys thought that everyone came from Adam and Eve 6,000 years ago or so, and now look, now there's populations of people that lived 10,000 years ago, and they lived 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, right? So they kind of mocked everybody by saying that, and now it turned around to be a slap in their face, which brings us to one of our first predictions, which is the haplotype block predictions versus the evolutionary haploblock type, right? Dr. Nathaniel Jensen would say that, we came along and we would say that the first haplotype people, Adam and Eve, would have had blocks the size of the entire chromosomes, right? Evolution would have never said that. So what do we see when we look inside of people today? Those balloons are going to represent haplogroups, okay? Now, we see different haplogroups, but a lot of people don't know why or when or how they got there or how they formed. So what we're going to do is we're going to look over at Adam's perfect genome, which was mutation-free. And the very next generation that came over with one mutation, got handed down, right? And then over time, another mutation, and another mutation occurred. So when this happens to a population, if we don't see very many mutations between people, they go back in ancestry not very far. But if we see more mutations in people, we can trace them further back in time. That means when we look at the populations of the world today, we can actually see that we can trace lineages back all the way to a single group of people. So that's how we determine what a haplogroup is. We look for markers and we go, oh, this group of people have one type of mutation that other groups don't have. So we can name them or letter them, whatever you want to call it. And now we have haplogroups. and those haplogroups form. And now we can say, interesting. So if we assume then that Adam and Eve had complete haplogroups that entire size, how fast would the recombination rate be to break down these blocks into smaller and smaller ones? That was one of the test group predictions that was done by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, who said, let's test this theory. Let's break this down and look at gene conversion rates and recombination rates and not make any assumptions about the past except for a hypothesis that they were entire blocks that got broken down. How far in the past could we go? So his prediction showed us that we could easily explain the haploblock groups that we have today could have formed in the biblical timeline, and they don't line up with evolution whatsoever. So then, how is that possible? Well, gene conversion breaks up linkage blocks. And we know that when we're looking at populations and groups of people, this is a genetic drift indicator right here, showing a population size and how many generations. Look at this. If you have a smaller group of generation of people, fixation is reached really, really fast. Some are lost and others reach fixation quickly. And what would we say happened? Well, after the flood, there wasn't a very many group of people, right? There was not many. And they were in small groups and they migrated together and they stayed in smaller populations and they grew in a population together. And then all of a sudden they went to the Tower of Babel where God confused the languages. Then they dispersed and broke up into smaller groups of people. And then once they were in these smaller groups, it started again. Gene conversion, recombination rate, breaking up all these blocks into different groups of people. And when we look at the human history, we go, wow, something happened around 5,000 years ago where human diversity rapidly exploded. And this is looking at exomes, by the way. And then Jensen ran it on single nucleotide variances and got the same results yet again. And they admit that mutations are relatively new. They only go back about 200 to 400 generations, and then something happened creating massive amounts of harmful mutations. Well, that's the biblical timeline. That's literally what we say happened. You know, mutations are arising in people, and we can literally go, well, if they're new mutations, we can trace them backwards in time. We get to a person that has less mutations. That can only be a good thing for them. Evolution says, it's okay. No, they don't make much of a difference. It's just mutations. So we'll get into that soon. But we're saying that this Tower of Babel, which has actually been found in historical things, this is what a carving and engraving showing that our ancestors actually believed in it as well. And it's one of the rocks we found. We see that if we trust the story and we go, where did this happen? Was this the Middle East? Or was this in Africa? Because if people lived in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, you would expect that massive people would also be migrating around in Africa and diversifying in smaller groups, getting mutations, and haplogroups would be forming left and right. But what do we see? We see the most haplogroups actually forming and exploding out of the Middle East, exactly where we would expect it to be, not in Africa. So think about that for a second. So we would say the exact opposite happened. We say that this happened, that all of these haplogroups started forming and grouping, and people began migrating around the world and getting isolated in different regions, but not this one. See, you're looking at Shem and Japheth's line, right? They branched off and they didn't have a border. Ham did. And let me explain it to you like this. The Tower of Babel is where all of the people were together at once. The languages got confused, and each son got handed down a inherited land. Ham's line got Africa. So they went into Africa from the Tower of Babel, and something unique happened. The Sahara Desert started to form, and it grew rapidly. And so as it grew rapidly, it pushed Ham's generations, or Ham's genealogies, deeper into Africa, and they became isolated and trapped. What would this do to genetic inheritance? Well, it now makes them so they can't mix with other people. So now they have smaller groups of people living in Africa. And these smaller groups of people are now stuck there with less genetic diversity than they would have had. And now all of a sudden, these groups of people have smaller population tribes. They're mutating faster because they're living in the tropical regions. They're living in smaller populations. They have faster rates of recombination. And all of a sudden, they're generating mutations at a faster rate. So it makes them look different than the other groups that are now able to intermingle with one another and diversify and go across the entire world and populate everything. That couldn't happen for Ham's line. They were stuck. They were trapped. And when we look back in history, what do we notice? Evolution tells us Well, if you go back into the past, humans came out of that bottleneck 200 to 300,000 years ago. It's like, okay, well, that would mean that humans lived for 100. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt here and just say it was 200,000 years ago. That means they lived for 195,000 years worldwide after, because out of Africa happened after this, everywhere. They lived, and they waited 195,000 years before they all started doing exactly the same thing everywhere. Human history starts being recorded about 5,000 years ago. All of history. What do we see? Civilizations rise 5,000 years ago. Writing systems between every group 5,000 years ago. How about mathematics? They say, oh, around the same time. Mathematics, we could trace it right back to one group of people. Boom. How about magnetic decay? Oh, same thing. Not very young. How about the oldest trees on Earth? Trees don't die. We have trees that are just, they think they're organisms that never perish. But yet the oldest trees in the world go right back to the flood. How come there isn't one 10,000 years old? That would easily refute us. The only time they can ever get those dates is because they might use something other than dendrochronology, where they're testing the actual rings of the tree. They have to infer it based on something else, because the obvious answer is not old. We have helium diffusion rates. Goes right back to the same timeline. How about the oldest desert in the world, the Sahara, what we just talked about? Well, guess what? That formed very, very quickly. They didn't expect that, and it formed fast, not very long ago. Oh, it went from green to a desert in a flash, exactly like we would assume it did. It went from lush to desert. How about genealogies? We can trace genealogies, and some of them are ancient. This is one in the British Museum. This one traces British kings that have an unbroken line of chain of evidence going all the way back to Noah himself. Then we look at flood legends around the world. That's amazing how much they even still have in common. Has anybody ever played the game of telephone when they were in school? That original story hardly makes it around the classroom without being totally distorted. So by the mere fact that they have flood traditions that even hold any resemblance at all is still amazing after this amount of time. But here comes another logical question then. If all people started out in the same place and knew the same type of thing, they had the same building construction, would that mean that they would take this knowledge with them? Because obviously they wouldn't take the same language. They lost that language. But one thing they wouldn't lose is the ability to how to construct something. And when we go to different places in the world, on the entire opposite continents even, we find that there are pyramids, there are construction zones that are all based on one particular thing, mathematics. And that mathematics is always the same, meaning it matches. And I'll show you exactly what I mean in this short clip that I got for you.
The diameter of the drop of water on a waterproof surface, like granite or alabaster, is constant. It measures 1 centimeter. They named this small unit the royal finger. 10 drops of water or 10 royal fingers equals 1 royal hand. 100 drops of water, so 100 royal fingers or 10 royal hands, equals 1 royal leg. Centuries later, these discoveries were taken out of secret coffers and renamed. The royal finger was called the centimeter, the royal hand the decimeter, and the royal leg the meter. They were presented as recent discoveries, and the French appropriated them, made in France. The diameter of the drop of fresh water measures what is now called 1 centimeter. Water is a universal constant. The size of the drop of fresh water will never change for thousands and millions of years. Yes, the universal unit, the meter, was not invented in 1780.
So quite interesting, right? How in the world could we have a mathematical situation where all people around the world know the exact same type of measurement? Well, it's because you can trace them back to a single group. It's a single group of people that were building and constructing the same tower. It's why they knew what to build and what worked and how to measure something. They might have lost the language, but they never lost the math. Or what makes more sense, the Egyptians decided to travel around the entire world themselves, creating the exact same structures everywhere. I mean, that makes no logical sense. But when we look at the construction of all pyramids that we've ever measured, they all use the meter. Now, what is the logical probability of that happening? I wouldn't want to defend that argument if I were you. So anytime there's a discrepancy and we find modern man outside of Africa, they just go, uh-oh, we just need to chalk it up to a primitive man, right? They found handprints that were discovered in Tibet. And, that's not in Africa. They're 300,000 years old, according to geology, right? That breaks up the tree of life, right? Wait a minute, man's supposed to be evolving in Africa, and they're stuck there. They can't even get out for another 150,000 years. So what's an identical human handprints and artwork doing somewhere else? Well, they just blame primitive man. They just say, well, it's some other species that was literally identical. So humans evolved twice then, is what they're saying, in totally different regions. So good times there. Then we have human population growth. This one doesn't look good for them at all, because when we're looking at the human population growth, that literally lines up with the biblical model of ancestry. You can't have groups of people living, even based on the decay curve of how many people have kids every generation. When we look at population growth arguments, that they line up with young earth creation numbers every time down the line. That doesn't make any sense if they're telling us that human beings have existed for even hundreds of thousands of years. You have to account for them not being able to produce what we can today. If you say, well, you know, they were just in Africa, they didn't migrate out, they were just trapped in this one region. Wait a minute, you just said that they were in other regions of the world. You said they were Neanderthals doing this, there were Denisovans doing this, there were other populations of humans growing. Why couldn't they do it? It's like, none of the story makes any sense. It's like they all just waited to the last 5,000 years before they all decided, yeah, we're going to grow. We're going to populate the entire world, and we're going to explode in population growth. That doesn't make any sense. So the testable predictions come from what we know and what we can see, and we can go, interesting. Let's make predictions now based on what we observe. Let's based on mutation rates, based on population growth rates, and let's take these back. And when you do that with evolution, you get the problem of Occam's razor, where, you know, the simplest explanation is usually the right one. Well, when we use young earth creation, all of the evidence is simple. It all lines up. They have to invent these ridiculous rescue devices, and that's why we have no problem. We have no problem saying that these haplogroups formed exactly where we think they formed. They formed rapidly all at once. Dispersion happened. We have evidence that we can only trace back to a single person in the recent history, not deep time. And there is no march of progress. Here's a video I made specifically on that one.
Rudy Zellinger's painting called The March of Progress was a fine illustration.
Today, we have two kinds of people in the world. We have those with such good imaginations that they really believe banana plants and whales are related, and that man is just an ape. Yes, they literally believe cladistics is scientific proof of that. This is the sad state of affairs, which have left us literally talking to walls. We might as well just be talking to our cat most of the time. So I thought today we would try a new approach. Rather than just show them evidence that is on our side and explain why the evidence best proves young earth creation rather than evolution, let's show them out of their own books that they were lied to. So let's begin, shall we? In the book, Early Man by Life magazine, one of the most popular March of Progress charts ever sold exists inside of it. More schools have this image hanging up than any other image regarding human evolution. But let's actually zoom in and read what the small print actually says. First, we come to Pliopithecus. You will notice it says, long considered to be an ancestral gibbons, the Pliopithecids are now known to be far removed from gibbons, or indeed any other living primates. So they admit that this doesn't even belong in the very chart. And it's the first step of this process, and it says underneath it that it's not true. Now, on to the next one, which is another supposed intermediary, which to them would now be the first step of man, which is proconsul. Well, they consider it a very early ape, an ancestor to the chimpanzee and perhaps the gorilla. So we have another pure ape which they still cannot identify as to what species it even is. But yet, there it is, standing up, representing human-like bipedalism. That is strike 2.
Importantly, though, each of these individuals depicted are monkeys, not just the first one. We humans are still a subset of Old World monkeys.
But let's move on. Next we have Dryopithecus. We read that after investigation of the skull, rather than evolving earlier than the great apes was as previously thought, it was actually just a great ape itself. A knowingly admitted lie right there in front of your eyes. I give this strike 3 on proving any human evolutionary tree whatsoever, and we've only looked at 3. So literally, their entire first links of the chain are admitted to not be part of the chain in the small print underneath. That would be strike 3.
It is already hard to tell where there could be a link still missing.
Next we have Oreopithecus, and this is hilarious because they start off by literally saying this is a side branch of the human family tree, meaning, yet again, it is not part of the March of Progress chart that it's on. And they are showing you it is part of the human lineage. But let's keep reading. Oh, look at that. It was clearly an aberrant ape. Shocker, I know. You will also notice that it is standing upright and walking when they know it's a lie. That would be strike 4. Next we have Ramapithecus. This was thought to be a distinct genus that was the first direct ancestor of modern humans, before it became regarded as that of the orangutan ancestor. Again, portrayed standing erect and walking, so strike 5, another fraud on the chart, shown in the March of Progress that doesn't belong there. Strike 5.
Oh, man.
Next, a famous one, Australopithecus africanus. It tells us they possessed the brain size of apes, had ape-like skulls, and was similar to body size and shape to apes. So if it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, walks like a duck, shaped like a duck, the size of a duck, then surely it's a duck, right? Yet, there it is, an admitted ape species with the characteristics of an ape in the human family tree, portrayed walking just like humans. They don't even try to say anything about it being transitional or having any features of transitional because it's clearly an ape. But again, do you notice anything in the image? Is that really the truth that they're trying to sell you? No, it's not, and not even close. It was a primate, nothing more. No transitional. Strike 6. Now we have Robustus. It states below in the fine print. He represents an evolutionary dead end in man's history. So what's it doing on the chart? He's an admitted dead end on the very chart itself, meaning not part of the human evolutionary March of Progress chart that they're showing you. And yet there it is anyway. They know that nobody reads this fine print. But here is something most people don't know. They changed its name to Paranthropus robustus, and that's how it's known today. Do you know why? Because para means beside, and anthropus means man. So it means beside man, meaning not leading to modern day man. Not only was it a different lineage, but an entirely different evolutionary branch than us. Yet there it is on the flow chart, leading from primitive primate ape ancestor to modern day man. Another lie. Strike 7. So now, let's look how far in we are. Notice that? Halfway through, and every single one is an outright ape. Nothing but a primate. Nothing but pure lies and frauds admitted in the very fine print below each and every one. And if that's not bad enough, if we open this poster and go to the far left, there's something written, and at the very bottom we read, although proto-apes and apes walked on all fours, all are shown here standing for the purpose of comparison. Sure it is, everyone. They want you to see them as human-like as possible, because they know that pictures are worth 1,000 words.
And they know nobody's going to read that small print. And it's going to look and appear as though apes became humans slowly over time, when it's nothing but pure lies.
Neanderthals, for example, were never considered to be part of our linear lineage. They're more like the older brothers of Homo sapiens. And they didn't drag their knuckles on the ground either. In fact, none of our ancestors did that. If you look at the lesser apes, they were already fully bipedal.
Here is why I call BS on this pathetic statement they made. One, we can clearly see that it's not true. If it was true, they would have all had straight parallel backs, like step 1 and the final step being human. Yet, we see the third primate in the chain on all fours. And then the next ones slightly bent over less and less the farther you go down the chain, portraying that they were getting better at standing upright. It has nothing to do with comparison. If they wanted to compare them, they would have all had them doing the exact same pose. So that is another outright lie. Let's look closer at these features they show. Notice the human is minimal in body hair, yet they start showing the two primates before him with less and less body hair, trying to swindle in as though they are slowly losing fur over time, when we all know there is zero evidence for any of that. So, another lie. Then we see primate faces that begin to shrink away until all of a sudden we have modern day man. But notice the difference? Man has long hair on his head. No primate does, nor can grow it. Man has a long beard. Primates cannot grow a long beard either. Man has hands that are only found on humans, but they want to try and show that primates doing things that only humans can do, like holding a club as a weapon. Lastly, you will notice that human feet are now placed on two of the primates before him on the chain. More visual lies. So these subtle visuals that they are lying about in the chart are a form of indoctrination to spread disinformation, while underneath it telling you the truth, that these are just primates. And the physical evidence that we have doesn't portray what they tell you it does. These are all lies. We have many huge physiological differences between us and apes, but they want you to think that we are just kissing cousins. Everything from our hair, our brain, our eyes, our lips, our tongues, our hearing, our visuals, our strength, our skin, our posture, our gut flora and digestion, our appendix, our muscles, the subcutaneous layer of fat that runs under our skin that apes don't have. The list goes on, but they want you to think, and they want to portray to you, that they are right next to us and that we popped right out from them along the chain of human evolution. Humans do not speciate. We did not come from another species, and we will not speciate in the future. Now we get into humans, with no transitions whatsoever. The first thing I want to point out is, look at this human that they have here. Do you notice something? Do you notice that he is not an African? Why is that? They believe it is. So why does he have no African traits? They want to have them appear as the average Caucasian for some reason. Yet, it's not what they believe. Just more subtle deceit. And they even admit that they're guessing. So let's read this together. It is a revealing story, not only for the creatures it shows, but also because it geographically illustrates how much can be learned from how little. What do they mean by how little? Well, actual evidence, that's what. Let's keep reading. Many of the figures shown here have been built up from far fewer fragments of a jaw, some teeth perhaps, as indicated by the white highlights, and thus are products of educated guessing. Let that sink in.
And importantly, all of these actually existed.
They admit that these are hypothetical, imaginary drawings made from educated guesses. This is the best evidence they have for human evolution. Nothing but pure SpongeBob imagination assumptions, in their own words. But let's move on now to humans. First, we come across Homo erectus,
The illusion in the Time Life book is based on entirely different fossils. The Ternurka fossils were unearthed during and after the early 1970s. Before that, Homo erectus stature could only be estimated from two discoveries, one in Java, the other in China, from femur bones. Now that we have more complete skeletons and fragments, we have even more of the story. They state, first man of our genus, modern limbs, but more primitive hands and brain. But let's investigate that. Oh, look at that. Modern day research has discovered that modern day fingers and hand bones have been discovered, and they actually turned out to be the same as ours. Shocker, I know, right, creationists? But if that's not bad enough, the brain size is far more similar to ours and far from other primates. They have tried to say that these ancestors of ours were smaller than us, and this proves that we are evolving larger, and the same with their brains. But this is not the case, as we have found some of them were even 6'1". And now we know that brain size has to do with the culture of the people and where they are living and what they are eating. The most complete skulls that we have show us that a lot of isolated tribes all have the same thing in common: smaller skulls and brains, and some bone abnormalities, usually the ribs and spine. The average African's height is 5 foot 5.5 inches, but then we go to the Netherlands and it's 5 foot 10 inches. So conditions play a huge factor on height and brain and skull. And if that's not bad enough for evolutionists, they recently discovered they were sailors and had language and navigation skills. Clearly, this is not a primate or some missing link ancestor to the human species. Just look at how they depict Homo erectus still to this day. If this isn't visual indoctrination using pure frauds and imagination to push a narrative, I don't know what is. Let's not take my words for it. Let's go to a paleoanthropologist himself. Listen to what he says. Or should I say, listen to what he admits. This is regarding height, by the way. On the very bottom, we read, "It's a case in the fossil record where discovering more seems to have resulted in us knowing less. But that's just because we can now reject several categorical statements that people used to accept uncritically." You see what he's saying here? He's admitting that their bias is in their own way. They cannot break the paradigm. It must be true, so it's rooted in their brain like a dogma. Something they cannot question, something they cannot fathom not being true. They are indoctrinated to believe it and cannot critically think of an alternative, because it must be true. And this is one of many reasons why evolution theory isn't science at all. And the sooner you wake up to that, the better. Next on the list you can see early Homo sapiens. But if you read the small print and you investigate what the three they're talking about are, they're now classified as nothing but Neanderthal. So we're just going to ignore this because it's nonsensical and another fraud that should have been removed from the list. So we're just going to move on to the next one. And next on the list we have Solo Man. In the small print, we can read, "An extinct race of Homo sapiens in Java. Solo Man so far is only known from 2 shin bones and some skull fragments." That's right, everyone. That entire picture is made up. Shocker, I know. Next in the list we have the famous Neanderthal. It says in the small print, "Not nearly as brutish of a fellow as his name has come to connote." You see, over time, the depictions of Neanderthal have changed greatly. He first started out as basically Bigfoot, a total primitive creature covered in long body fur. As time went on, they couldn't ignore the facts, and they had to convert him to a modern-day human being that really looks no different than some people that are alive today. But let's go on. Next we read, "They had the cranial capacity, in some cases, larger than that of modern man,
And he made a variety of tools advanced in design. Now think about that. Larger skulls, larger brain, and yet supposedly lived far before us, and were more primitive and stupid. That doesn't line up with what we see. You can't just find a skull that is smaller than another one, then line them up next to others and say this is proof of gradual upward evolution. Then find skulls that are the exact opposite of that idea, which are much larger, and then use the opposite explanation to explain the same outcome. This is what's called political doublespeak, and they resort to this all the time. This is what they love to do and have to do when the evidence contradicts the story they invented. They never predicted to find what they did with Neanderthal and Denisovan. As a matter of fact, when Darwin himself first saw the popular Neanderthal skull, he said, "Some skulls of very high antiquity, such as the famous one of Neanderthal, are well developed and capacious," meaning having lots of room. And that was it. He moved on as though it never existed and never brought it up again, ever. Why do you think that is? Because it completely contradicted his theory. Even Huxley admitted this and said that this proves evolution is not a slow, gradual process that Darwin speaks of, but it must move in fast jumps. Here they are looking at something that does not line up with what they predicted. This is a falsification of that theory, right in front of their eyes. And that's why, even though this skull was the most famous and popular skull at Darwin's time, he never talked about it. Critics who know nothing about the biblical model of ancestry always bring up inbreeding, like it's somehow a problem for our model but not theirs. They think that Noah and his children would have an inbreeding problem after getting off the ark. Let me take a brief moment to explain why inbreeding is not a problem and how Neanderthal and Denisovan fit into the biblical perspective, and why it makes way more sense than the story they've invented around these people, and why over the decades they've been falsified time and time again. First, no. Inbreeding was not a problem for Noah's offspring because of one major factor: population growth. God knew this because he created us and gave us two rules from the beginning, both to Adam and Eve and then again to Noah. It was be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. What is funny about this is that evolution theory does have an inbreeding problem. Just ask Darwin himself. Just kidding. But you see, small populations over long periods of evolutionary time would lead to horrible problems. One that proves evolution cannot actually happen. Imagine small populations of people living for many tens of thousands of years, from bottleneck to bottleneck to bottleneck. Then, after the last bottleneck about 200,000 years ago, humans are stuck in Africa in small tribes for something like 150,000 years. Inbreeding. How could this be? It's nonsense, and genetics tells us it's nonsense. Humanity would have died out long before any of this story played out. If this was the case, there would be far more genetic evidence of fixed substitutions in the human population, especially with a fast mutation rate and how few fixed substitutions there actually are. There can only be one explanation, and that is mankind is not old. There are no other options, people. So not only are they mocking the concept that doesn't have an inbreeding problem, they actually forget how bad of an inbreeding problem their own model has. Oh, the irony in all of this. But they have put their foot in their mouth yet again, and they go on and say that it's not just people, but animals as well that would have an inbreeding problem, and that there is no way Noah's Ark could be true because of it. Sadly for them, we literally have examples of this bottleneck scenario playing out, proving that this is not a problem yet again. You see, the Bible gives an account that God sent Noah 2 of every kind of animal and 7 pairs of the clean. These animals got off the ark to migrate around the world and repopulate the earth. That is what Noah took them for. So, if this was true, could we just take two animals of a single kind and place them on, let's say, an island and see how they do? See if they can survive from incest. Oh, look at that. The answer is yes. This exact thing happened in 1957 when we took a single pair of mouflon sheep and left them on the Krulligan Islands near the Antarctic Circle. In 1977, when they returned, the number had grown to 700 sheep. That's just 20 years being stuck on a small island. And considering male sheep are nomadic travelers by nature, yet they couldn't being isolated, this utterly proves that even though the conditions which were not even suitable for them, yet they had no problems whatsoever. And given that the population began with only 2 individuals that were isolated on an island, the researchers had the perfect sample to test this inbreeding scenario of a bottleneck and what would happen. Their biased belief in evolution made them predict that this could not be possible, yet it did, and the study confirms it. And it shows, even in their writing, how shocked they were and at how unexpected this was. But this is just one of many examples of this scenario playing out in real time, which falsifies a global bottleneck scenario inbreeding problem. The problem is small populations who do not expand in size. And this is what we see with Neanderthal and Denisovan. So this takes us into the next chapter. Who were they? These were just grandchildren of Noah, who were just a small group of people who left the population to live on their own and eventually became isolated with a shrinking population and died from incest. And yes, we have evidence for this.
They lived together in small groups and reproduced amongst themselves, and that could cause genetic problems. A healthy gene pool needs constant imports and exports of material.
It appears that they lived in small groups with perhaps 20 or 30 people. A large clan might have 2 or 3 families. These small groups moved over relatively large areas.
Well, think about it. How could a small population confined to inbreeding last? Well, that question has been asked, and a new study has found that there is no possible way that Neanderthals could have existed for even over 10,000 years. So much for 400,000 years, huh? Everything they thought is literally crumbling and falling in between their fingers. And they still can't see the obvious. So yes, Neanderthals are best explained in our model, and everything about them tells us they were just normal people who lived alongside of other humans, and all others today are still related to them in some way or another, because their parents were our grandparents. So of course we're all going to share some genetic relation with them. And yes, even Africans, whom evolutionists denied, by the way, that would ever be the case. So you see, at first they said they were a totally different species. But then they had to admit, well, they can breed with us. So that idea was removed from them being a different species by definition. Then they tried to say that, well, they're a subspecies, just a different offshoot branch of humans. Then that was falsified when they found Denisovan and modern day people share a lot of genetic similarity with them. Then they said, well, they're not a different species nor a subspecies, but they're just a single dead-end branch of only the European ancestry through evolution. But then they found that even Africans have their DNA in them as well, so that falsified that idea too. Basically, everything that they once said about them has turned out to be 100% wrong. These were just sons and daughters of one of Noah's grandchildren who decided to live a life of exploration and unfortunately chose to go north. They got lost and they died from genetic disorders from living in small numbers and inbreeding over the 1,000 years. This also explains their lack of chin, which even modern-day Australian Aborigines share because of this inbreeding problem that they have as well. So the last question would be,
Why don't we share more genetic similarity with these ancient Neanderthal if they just lived a few thousand years ago? Wouldn't it take tens of thousands of years for DNA similarity to be weeded out? Actually, no. And published in Genetics, a team conducted simulations to model what would happen if Neanderthal did indeed occur mutations at a quicker rate than modern humans. What would happen to the offspring shared between humans and Neanderthal? Well, the study revealed that rather than genetic similarity slowly declining over time, Neanderthal DNA in modern human genomes would have been rapidly decreased during the first 10 up to 20 generations. So a time period of less than 600 years maximum. Then it would remain unchanged throughout all future generations. And this is exactly what we see. Neanderthals being a product of evolution is falsified. But now let's listen to what evolutionists have to say about Neanderthal and when they flip-flopped on what they once said was a fact.
The science constantly changes how we envisage Neanderthals.
After the first archaeological evidence of Neanderthals was discovered in the 19th century, many experts described this species as ape-like. A more realistic picture of the Neanderthals evolved decades later.
It's sad how they can just get away with pushing lies for decades and then just use the excuse, well, we've learned more now, and then all of a sudden it makes it just okay. But this is evolution we're talking about, so why would anyone expect honesty at this point?
Were the Neanderthals able to develop a culture as we understand the term today? Expert opinion on this topic is divided, since there's no hard evidence of songs or dances, if indeed they had any.
No evidence of song or dance. What do you expect you're going to find a fossil of a Neanderthal dancing as he's dead? What kind of nonsense is this? And of course we know they had songs. Why? Because we've literally found an instrument that they made. The insanity at this point is just next level. They cannot break out of the evolutionary mindset. It has hindered them from thinking critically and using basic logic at this point. But let's move on.
The evidence indicates that there were several groups, and each had its own territory. And once or twice a year, they'd meet at one place to engage in common activity.
These meetings would produce the desired results only if the various groups could communicate with each other. Scientists have been studying what sort of language the Neanderthals may have spoken. In any case, these ancient humans do seem to have had the physical capability to speak.
But we know that the ear bones of Neanderthals seem to be functioning like ours do for sound transmission, the same range of frequencies, so their hearing certainly would have given them the same capabilities as we have in terms of hearing language. So I think all of that suggests Neanderthals had a basic language. They were talking to each other, they had speech capabilities.
Like you're going to go and meet up with a group of people that you're going to be building things with and hunting with and trading with and not even have the ability to communicate to one another? I mean, come on. See, the reason this is so confusing for the evolutionists is because, one, they thought they couldn't speak, have the capacity to speak, nor the brain power to do it. Then they learned, oh, they have all of those, so I guess they could. So, yet again, more evidence against them, and what they used to say.
They were nomads, but they lived in a rather limited region where each site fulfilled a specific function, like extracting raw materials or slaughtering animals. And they created living spaces in sloped areas that protected them from high winds. They knew how to make good use of these narrowly defined areas.
And yet, no matter where we look or where we go, whether it's Denisovan or Neanderthal, we find that they had advanced technology for primitive people. Now consider this. Imagine you went back in time with nothing except for what you have in your own mind. We would already have an edge based on our knowledge. But could we survive just like they did, and then also take the time to make what they made in their spare time? That's pretty incredible, actually, considering the harsh conditions at the time when they lived. This is after the flood, when the Ice Age came down all the way to where they were living. Let's look at some of the things that they created. This, for example, was made by the Denisovans.
This incredible object was dated between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago, but just under a decade later in 2017, there was some speculation it was even older, being between 65,000 and 70,000 years old. Although, as far as I can see, this was never confirmed. In 2008, the world's oldest stone bracelet was discovered, the handiwork of a now extinct species, subspecies or population of humans that scientists call the Denisovans. It was found in stratum 11 of the world famous Denisova cave, located in the Altai region of Siberia. And it truly is one of a kind, showing technical skills in fine stonework long before we ever thought was possible. Whoever its wearer and whatever its importance, it is a find that fundamentally changed our views on the Denisovans, showing us they were far more advanced than we ever thought was possible. In bright sunlight, the green chlorite would have reflected the rays of the sun, and at night by a fireside it would have cast a deep shade of green. It is also delicate and very fragile, which is why the experts believe it was worn on special occasions only, and wasn't an everyday object. We can see the smooth, clearly polished curving outer edge of the bracelet, and the circular drill hole that's running through it, which has a diameter of 8mm. The bracelet is less than a centimetre in thickness, and it has an estimated diameter of around 7 centimetres, shown here on the wrist of a mannequin. Inspecting the artefact, and scientists stated that the drill that was used to make the hole had a relatively high speed with minimal fluctuations. Some kind of implement was used, and so the technology for the day was certainly advanced. The Denisovans had clearly mastered skills that were considered uncharacteristic for the Paleolithic. They could precisely drill, grind and polish even the most intricate of artefacts, and the outcome really is truly stunning. Chlorite was also not local to the cave it was found in, and would have had to have come from at least 200 kilometres away, meaning it was likely a precious and valuable material for the time. Next to the hole on the outer surface, there is a specific zone of polishing, indicating it was in constant contact with some kind of soft organic material. It's possible there was a leather strap attached, likely with a heavy charm hanging from it. The polishing around the hole has helped the experts to distinguish the top and bottom of the bracelet. Although this is the most spectacular find, the Denisova cave has also brought forth many other objects, including a 50,000-year-old needle, as well as a ring that's carved out of marble. Here we can see pendants made from animal teeth, as well as tools that were fashioned from bone. This is a 50,000-year-old tiara that was made from woolly mammoth ivory, another artefact that shows incredible technical know-how. The Denisovans would have had to remove the tusk from the mammoth, cut it into thin pieces, and then soak it in water before bending it into shape. Then there was scraping, cutting, grinding and polishing, a variety of different techniques to achieve the final product. The Denisovans were clearly sophisticated, and experts believe they were more progressive than both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. So how and why Homo sapiens outlived them we still don't know.
It really is sad how the theory of evolution makes people not see the obvious, but let's move on. Next we have Cro-Magnon man. They state, only a cultural step away from modern man. The brain capacity was about 1,600 cc, somewhat larger than the average modern-day human, but produced a variety of sophisticated tools, such as retouched blades and scrapers, nosed scrapers, the chisel-like tool known as a burin, and fine bone tools as well. So they separated Cro-Magnon man from us originally because of the tools they found. Think about that. Let's really look at the difference between them and us, shall we? Oh, look at that. They're actually modern in every anatomical respect to us. What a shocker. Jeez. It's amazing what happens when you actually read the small print that they don't intend for the public to ever read.
The only reason any of these should exist is because evolution is true, and none of these would exist otherwise.
Forensic investigators find a corpse in a river about a week old, and they can't tell you anything about it. But they find a finger bone in the middle of a field 1 mile underneath the ground, and they build an entire life story off of it. That should tell you something right there.
Paleontologists are excited about this, Mr. Speaker, but no one's pointing out that the textbooks, I guess, will need to be changed because the old theory of evolution taught for 77 years in the classrooms of America as fact is suddenly replaced by a new theory, or I hasten to add, I'm sure we'll be told, a new fact.
Evolution theory is, was, and always will be a racist theory at its core that died decades ago. But unfortunately, it's always going to plague our school system and society because it's protected by law and pushed onto our children with no alternative. The sooner people wake up to this reality, the better. Sadly, most will never see the agenda, nor be able to break the indoctrination, even when better evidence is presented.
I would simply and humbly ask, can we teach it as such? And can we also consider teaching other theories of the origin of species, like the theory that was believed in by every signer of the Declaration of Independence? Every signer of the Declaration of Independence believed that men and women were created and were endowed by that same Creator with certain unalienable rights. The Bible tells us that God created man in His own image, male and female, He created them. And I believe that, Mr. Speaker.
There's a reason intelligent design isn't taught in our learning institutions. The legal staff of Freedom from Religion Foundation, a church-state watchdog group, has had remarkable success in convincing many institutions, such as school boards and town councils, that they are breaking constitutional law when they sponsor sectarian activities. That includes intelligent design. When the authorities can't be convinced, Freedom from Religion Foundation sues, and it wins more often than not.
The reason I made such a long series debunking this is because the human evolution chart still plagues the schools to this day, and it is one of the most popular images on Earth regarding human evolution. So when someone comes along and tries to say, this is an old, outdated chart, remind them, if it's so outdated and worthless, then why haven't they removed it from the classroom? Why haven't they told everybody that the March of Progress visual is a lie? Because I agree, it is old, outdated, and 100% worthless. And the fact that they still use it shows how little they care about lying to the public and how little has changed since that time it was made, including how pathetic the overall evidence for evolution actually is. Since that time, have we actually discovered more missing links, supposedly? Yeah, of course. As long as you want to count frauds upon frauds and lies after lies as missing links, we have a lot. But if you actually investigate and can read in between the lies, you will quickly see that the fable falls apart on every one. Every one of them is nothing but fancy stories hyped up to sell and get famous from, and get more government grant money, and make a name for yourself in the field of paleontology. That's what it has become all about. They know that all they have to do is just find some new strange anomaly and create a story for a quick headline that makes them very popular, no matter how wrong it is. The public quickly forgets about the fact that it was a lie and retracted later. But we will cover all of these frauds at another time because there are so many.
We will move on to the next one right now, which is the Y chromosome. Now, this one is unique because this one really destroys all of them, because mutations build up in the Y chromosome, and we can literally say, well, if deep time evolution is true, we should be able to trace these backwards to a common ancestor split, right? Where the Y chromosome would be saturated in mutations because mutations happen there so quickly. But if young Earth creation is true, we'd be able to trace backwards in time to a recent common ancestor of Noah with only few mutations and not even close to mutational saturation. So what happens is when we look in there, we go, we can build a phylogenetic chart on the ancestry, and we see the Y chromosome mutation rates higher again in Africans. So therefore, the evolution goes, that must mean that Africans are the oldest again because they have the most mutations. Well, that comes down to predictive power yet again, because that takes an assumption. And that assumption is that mutations are always the same between every single people group in the world. And that also assumes that mutations are slow and always constant between all people groups, and that Africans always existed first and that only people came later after them. But that is where it gets destroyed again by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And he wrote this information in a book that you can find called Traced. And in this book, that's highly technical, I'm going to break down for you. We see that in it, he breaks down 4 different study groups. And when we look at the 2 blue ones on the left, we see that these are pedigree studies. And these pedigree studies only looked at a very small section of the Y chromosome. And they didn't look at the entire thing because sequencing the entire thing is very hard. And the reason why is because it's about 58,000 to 600,000 base pairs with 200 genes. So it's very, very complicated. And what happened is when they were looking at the 2 on the left, by just looking at a small section, they only found a few mutations. And they said, oh, good. Just a few mutations is really good for us because the mutation rate's very slow if you just count those mutations up. And therefore, we can get very old dates. And therefore, they plastered everywhere that humans must go back hundreds of thousands of years because the mutation rate is slow there. But then somebody decided to sequence the entire thing. And this is really good because once they sequenced the entire Y chromosome, the exact opposite evidence came in with a mutation rate more than double of what they had expected it to be, because they didn't expect other mutations to be in the other regions of the Y chromosome. And the reason they didn't expect it to be there is because in mitochondria and in other parts of the genome, the mutations occur in what are called hotspots. And so they gather there, for example, in the D loop of the mitochondria. So therefore, when they found mutations in the Y chromosome in one little region, they said, oh, they must not be occurring in another region. So it makes kind of logical sense, but it wasn't for sure. Nobody had ever tested the entire thing. So then what happened is Dr. Jeanson ran that and said, oh, look at that. There is tons of mutations in that region. And when the study discovered this, they went, uh-oh. So they actually hid this information in the supplemental area and didn't let the public know. And they said that this information prompted us to explore additional filters, meaning they went, oh, that contradicts what we need to be true. That's way too fast for deep time evolution. We're just going to say that we have to look at other filters now that give us a slower rate. We're going to ignore that area. And then another study in 2017 came out, making the mutation rate even faster. And so what happened is Moretti came across and said, we're going to do pedigree studies on 17 father pair sons. We're going to look at the entire thing, and we're going to break down the entire raw data and see how many mutations are there. And lo and behold, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson predicting that the Y chromosome should go back just a few thousand years was absolutely spot on. And we got another prediction made by creation that was true, that the mutation rate was going to be fast, and it pointed to a recent common ancestor of Noah going into the past. And then we jump back into his book, which is the Rosetta Stone of human history, and it shows us the true answer to this Y chromosome data, where he decided, I wonder how many total mutations are in people's Y chromosome alive today. And he did just that. And he said that there are about 440 mutations. Well, if there's 3 mutations per person per generation, how many generations back does that go? It's only about 150. That's not far. So if we use a generation time of just 30 years, that takes us back about 4,380 years. Exactly what we would predict if the global flood was true, based on mutation rate accumulation through the Y chromosome. And see, the mitochondria is very hard to test. The reason why it's hard to test for mutations is because every generation doesn't even get one mutation. It gets like less than half of one. So it's very hard to actually count. But this is very easy to count because it's more than one. So we don't have to guess. We don't have to go, oh man, this person got less than one, less than half of one. This person got half of one. This one's just much, much better, much more clear. The data is easily read, but it gets better. Now, what would happen if we went back to Noah and we started counting from Noah? Because we have a prediction made, right, in Scripture, right? We said, it writes that in the generation of Peleg, the people dispersed and went across the world. Well, that can be tested now. So what happened is Dr. Jensen said, what is the common ancestor mutation of the person that was the common ancestor of all of the haplogroups that formed rapidly? Well, guess what? If you count from Noah and you go to Shem and then Abram or Elam, and then you go to Canaan, Salah, Eber, Joktan, which is the 6th generation over, you get to Peleg's generation, Joktan and Peleg. And then we have the history of the world written in Scripture right here. That's exactly what happens when you get to that generation. When we read, all the haplogroups form. So what are the odds of that? We literally have the evidence, like what Dr. Jensen said, that is the Rosetta Stone of human history, because we don't have to just prove that we can go all the way back to Noah. He's gone a step further and shown that we can actually count from Noah forward and also get predictions correct on that as well. So that makes creation another awesome, powerful tool to prove the biblical model of ancestry that shows we're much more recent, and that there is not, again, another line of lots of male ancestors going into the past hidden somewhere in our genetics and DNA. That doesn't show up anywhere, right? And when you compare the Y chromosome to, let's say, a chimpanzee, it's horrendously different. It doesn't match at all. Matter of fact, it's so different that it actually matches more of a gorilla than it actually does a human being. So it's the exact opposite what they would expect when you're trying to use it in evolution, let alone human ancestry. It doesn't even work with evolutionary history, because we see that the study of the Y chromosome that developed unusual structures that make them very unique to humans. So if you wanted to learn more on that one, there is a local global flood video that exists specifically on that. Also a book as well, but the videos are a little more entertaining sometimes. And then that brings us to the next one, which is females now. This takes us into the mitochondria, which gives us the same thing. What did evolution predict? Well, they predicted very few mutations, right? And so creation, we predicted a lot of them. So evolution came along and they didn't have any observable data yet. So what did they do? They said, well, we assume that a split happened 6 to 7 million years ago. So we're going to calculate that in. And then we're going to use and build this molecular data and calibrate it to the fossil record. We're not going to use observable data because we just don't really have any yet. We're just going to assume evolution is true first and then go from there. So they started building their phylogenetic charts around this and started getting random dates. And the dates go all the way from 1991, that was the earliest I could find, all the way up until current times. The ranges go from 72,000 to over 300,000 years. But they predicted that we would find, based on this, to turn, a common ancestor, one substitution every 300 to 600 generations. But what we did find is the exact opposite. We found one substitution occurring every 33 generations. It was 20 times higher than was expected for evolution to be true, and only takes us back to around 6,000 to 12,000 years. The exact opposite of what evolution needed to be true, and not even close to what they could even push back by using the slowest studies that they've ever found. Instead, they got what they needed to change later, which was the observable rate that takes us back to a mitochondrial eve around 6,500 years ago. And that's because there's two different clocks. There's the phylogenetic rate, which I told you they invented, and the one that we actually see and observe, and what actually we can make predictions on, as opposed to what we can't make predictions on because it's based on a lie. So therefore, do they still do this today? Well, here's an eons evolutionary video of them admitting, yes, they do that very thing.
by using the molecular clock method. This method combines what we know, or at least what we think, about how often genetic mutations occur, and then applies that to DNA samples to plot the evolutionary history of various species. But to be accurate, this molecular clock needs to be calibrated.
The molecular clock. The clock needs to be calibrated.
This molecular clock needs to be calibrated.
The latest molecular clock calibrations.
So yes, they don't even feel embarrassed about saying that it needs to be calibrated. They just say, yeah, we calibrate the clock. It's no big deal. What do you mean it's no big deal? You're assuming evolution is true. The clocks that are observable say it's not true. So you calibrate the clocks to say that it is true. Get out of here. That is ridiculous. That is so nonsensical. It is foolish. And they know that the observable one is trustable because guess what? The FBI uses the rate. They use it to convict murderers. You can't say that the clock's not true when there's people being convicted of crimes today because of it. So it has to be true, or else they're going to be letting a lot of people out of prison. So we know it's true because they're literally getting a mutation somewhere in the germline, and then it's passed on to the next generation. So let's say that I decide to go kill my neighbor, and then I stab him in the neck and he dies, and they come over and they arrest me, and I go, I didn't do it, my dad did. That's why, and then they go, oh, the DNA evidence is showing that, yeah, one of them did it. We just don't know which one. They have similar DNA. So what they do is they look in the blood and they go, uh-oh, there's a mutation in that the dad doesn't have. It could not have been his dad. It had to have been him that killed him. So that's how important it is to know that mutation rates are important, and they are used in science, and they are used by the FBI. That's because they matter. So when people say, oh, who cares about these? Nobody cares. Nobody uses them. Yes, they do. They have to be used. And yes, they are accurate. They're not using the evolutionary one. Why? Because it's not true. That's why.
All right. So what you're looking at is a chart showing that pedigree mutation rates are very different than the evolutionary assumption phylogenetic rate, which based on the fossil record and split divergent time of common ancestors. Usually when we're referring to this, we use the chimpanzee split 7.5 million years ago in human beings. Because we're mostly going to be focusing on human beings in this, that's important to know. Now, I am going to touch on some animals to show that they also agree with the pedigree mutation rates, which is the young Earth creation results. But we're going to be focusing mostly on humans because these types of studies have been done many more times than animals have ever been. So to go over and to reiterate really quick, molecular clocks, all of them are calibrated to the reference of human chimpanzee split, which was assumed to be between 6 to 7 million years ago. So they build their mutation rate based on this assumption being true. We don't really like that too much because we believe that what we observe in studies is more plausible than what should be just assumed based on random chance of some theory, right? So when we see a mutation rate that's very quick and it doesn't line up with the fossil record, that's what we would expect as creationists because the fossil record is not true. So what do these dates point to? What are they showing us? Is there any consistency, or is there a theme, or are the dates really just all over the place and there is no such thing as a clock? Now we're going to cover that today. And another thing we're going to cover is the difference between substitution rates and regular mutation rates. So what that means is that substitution rates deal with populations. So because the evolutionists like to harp on saying, well, you're not looking at the substitution rate, you only look at the mutation rate, and that's not right. Well, they kind of work out to be about the same anyway. But to appease them, today we're going to be looking at studies that looked at the substitution rate and show that they also agree with the fast mutation rate. So I would have liked to have been able to find a nice visual for the Howell study in 1995, but I could not do that. So we're going to skip over that one and jump into this study that was done the very next year in 1996. And it was done by Kate Bendall in 1996, who obtained 4 substitutions out of 360, or 1 out of 85. But this is looking at the control region and a specific region inside of it called the HVR1. So I highlighted it right here. You usually want to look at both. That's the goal of any type of study that's going to actually be looking for an accurate substitution rate, because HVR1 and HVR2 tick at different rates. HVR1 ticks slower than 2. So you take the two and you combine them, and right in the middle is your accurate rate. So you're always going to get a slower substitution rate by looking at this one. And you can see that is done here. You'll notice that it's one substitution out of every 85 generations. Parsons was around 1 out of every 30 to 33, which we'll get to. So this is twice as slow as the next studies that we'll see. They do get a little bit better, but you'll notice that this one right here is the next study done in 1997 by Mum. Interesting name. HVR1 was the only region that was tested. You'll notice that got pretty good results. 1 out of every 55 generations found a substitution. These studies were not designed or intended to investigate a mutation rate in mtDNA. Rather, it was to verify two families that were related to one another. So they did not need to test the entire D-loop region. They only had to do one of the regions, and it wasn't to try to obtain an accurate substitution rate. They were trying to find relation. That's why they didn't waste their time with HVR1 and HVR2. They didn't need to. Also, MUM, the study that came right after that, they only looked in one region. Again, that collects only half the mutations that occur in those regions. So, which ended up overlooking different heteroplasmic mutations, and it explains why they got a slower result. But then the next study comes, the largest ever yet of its time in 1997, obtained by Parsons. He noticed that there were 10 mutations per 327 generations. Again, these are substitution, which works out to be 1 every 32.7, which was the math that was done on the last one. He also made sure to not include the poly-C tract, which can skew up results. And you'll notice right here, he calculated both of the regions. That's why his results were so good and so much more accurate, and why they're used by the FBI to this day. You'll see in the report that the mutation rate also concurred with the substitution rate, and we landed on a mitochondrial eve around 6,500 years ago. And his results are so good that they've been published in the Forensic DNA Application Analysis Handbook, and they are used by the FBI to track down killers. So his results are very accurate, or else we would be convicting the wrong people.
And yes, they reported this in their initial study. I highlighted that area for you. Next, I think there are people out there who doubt this, or think that we're lying in regards to the results of these studies landing on 6,500 years date for Eve. So I will show you here directly from the study itself, that is what the results were. And I'll just read part of this here, starting at the first red arrow. I'm just going to read word for word so you can see for yourself that it's not just some made-up young Earth creation argument. Using our empirical rate to calculate the mtDNA molecular clock would result in an age of mtDNA most recent common ancestor of only 6,500 years, clearly incompatible with the known age of modern humans. Even acknowledging that the most recent common ancestor of mtDNA may be younger than the most recent common ancestor of modern humans, it remains implausible to explain the known geographic distribution of mtDNA sequence variation by human migration that occurred only in the last 6,500 years. So as you can see, they can't explain it, but that's what the results were.
Next, they didn't believe it, so somebody joined his team named Holland, who came to join him to refute his work and actually confirmed it, but actually even made the rate faster because they actually discovered that there were 10 substitutions every 306 generations, which would make that 1 out of every 30 generations, confirming the fast mutation rate yet again. So fast mutation rate, fast substitution rate, they both land on the biblical time frame. Of course, some people would be like 6,500, that's 500 years off, you know, if they want to really get petty. But that doesn't matter because we also have the Greek Septuagint, and which would say that actually Adam and Eve were around 7,500 years ago. But I guarantee you, you give that to them, they'll just discard that anyway. They don't want answers. They're not interested in these kind of facts. They're just interested in you being wrong. Just remember that. Next. The next study that was done, she found 1 substitution every 61 generations, right? Which is close to the previous ones. So then we have another fast mutation rate. Why aren't these landing on evolutionary deep time frames 150 to 200,000 years ago? Because those dates are made up. They're not true. That's why they invented this phylogenetic method, because these dates confirmed that it's not good for evolution. The next one, How et al. He comes forward and he does another one, but he pooled his information together. He used the control region and he pooled data together from all of these other studies. Some of them found no mutations at all. But guess what he obtained? 2 substitutions every 88 generations, which works out to be 1 out of every 44. Very close to Parsons and Holland anyway, even though they were pooling the data together with other studies that were not generally as good. So again, what is his conclusions on this? In 2003, he stated, as in other studies, our estimation is much higher than those obtained by phylogenetic methods. See, they're starting to realize, wait a minute, every time we do one of these observable studies, it doesn't match. You see, the critics will say things like, oh, well, maybe they're counting somatic mutations, like these experts don't know what they're doing, right? Or, oh, in the deep past, selection was a lot stronger. You'll notice that they just throw out stories without any evidence, without any facts, with nothing, because they need their story to be true. And these studies prove that their story is not true. That's why they hate these mutation rates. There's other reasons they hate them too. But I digress. Next one, Sergren, I'm not even going to try to begin to pronounce his last name here, came to another study, and guess what he found? Both of our studies, his and Parsons, came to the remarkably similar conclusion. They state that right down here. Another one, extremely fast mutation rate, came to the same exact thing. The rate of mutation, 1 substitution every 25 to 40 generations. Oh, amazing. Exactly the same thing yet again. It's a concurrent theme, isn't it? So as discussed by Sergrid, remember, in 2000, it is rather a phylogenetic rate estimate that it may be biased. Interesting. Now he's saying their evolutionary rate is biased because it doesn't ever agree with what we see. Amazing, right? It is clear that the pedigree studies prove a more direct estimate of the mutation rate. Are they? Can I dare say they're actually onto something here? How about the next one? In 2005, Santos here, this study looked at the entire D-loop region, very similar to how Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson did in his 2015 Ding et al. Study, and they found 11 substitutions out of 321 generations, which is 1 substitution every 29 generations. Basically the exact same as Parsons, who got 1 out of 30 and 1 out of 33. Amazing, right? Constantly finding the same results. Then in 2012, we're getting more current. Basically found the identical mutation rate as Parsons did. Look at that. And here in the highlighted section, it says these values are much higher than those even estimated by Howell's estimations, and 13 to 42 times higher than the phylogenetic estimates for HVR1 in the same range. So imagine that, right? The phylogenetic rate, based on evolution being true, assumes, well, what do they assume? Let's look. They predicted that there would be 1 substitution every 6,000 to 12,000 years. But that would not even be close to 1, even in our entire lifetime. That means that 1 substitution would occur at how old the Earth is. Yet we're seeing 2 or 3 substitutions occurring in a human lifetime, if it's every 30 years. So very easy for us to explain. And theirs is based on the unobserved guessing of the fossil record. So when we see these admissions here, that it's 13 to 42 times higher than their estimates of that particular region based on the fossil record, which is also a slower region, as you guys saw earlier, then what does that tell you about the faster region of HVR2? And it's just that much more devastating to them. How about this one? They did a pedigree study on this one, on the haplogroup, and they believe that this haplogroup formed about 4,000 years ago. Oh, the ancestor to that haplogroup is just 4,000 years ago. A whole people group. Interesting, right? So we're going to get more into that one when I'll move that even further down so we can cover it in a minute. Here's a model that was created, a simulation based on the data that they had. They pooled everything together up until this point in 2004, and they said that the MCRA, most recent common ancestor of all present-day human beings, lived just a few thousand years ago in all of their models. So every time they ran it, they could only get it back a few thousand years, exactly what we would expect in the biblical time frame, in the biblical model. Even simulations agree with it. So evolution theory estimated that one substitution every 300 to 600 generations to go from this to this. That is why they need to slow these rates down. It is devastating to them. So that study that I had just showed you, I believe it was this one. Yes, the simulation. This was their result on their time frame of that. And you'll see that the most recent common ancestor was about 300 BC, and all modern human beings 3000 BC. Oh my goodness, look at that. What a shocker. What else do we have? We have another study here that was done on demographics. It says the more realistic model estimates that the most recent common ancestor of mankind lived as recently as 3,000 years ago, and that the identical ancestor point to a recent several thousand years ago. Look at that every single time. So what do we find? We're seeing constant, uncalibrated mutation rates based on no assumptions of the past, telling us that the mitochondrial clock is showing a most recent common ancestor of Eve living just thousands of years ago, not even tens of thousands, let alone hundreds of thousands or even millions of years ago. None of that's true. That's why this works. And look at the statement here. Using the new clock, she would estimate a mere 6,000 years ago for Eve, the mother of all living beings. Interesting, right? It is pretty clear that pedigree mutation studies provide a better direct estimate of that. So the critics don't really like Nathaniel Jensen. They'll say, well, he didn't consider coalescence. Look, from his very own study, this represents a coalescence calculation, the calculation most generous to the evolutionary model. So I'm sorry, yet again, evolutionist, you are wrong. Coalescence was considered, and it's considered in all of these other studies that we've been looking at as well. Another one, they said, oh, well, they're probably counting somatic mutations. Well, guess what? They thought of that a long time ago, because this was early on in these Parsons studies in the 1990s and early 2000s. And listen to what they say. Our data clearly show that the heteroplasmic mutation in their lineages were inherited through multiple generations, and therefore they cannot be somatic. They can't be. Here, somatic variance is untenable. It's not even a good argument anymore, is what they're saying. So remember, they're trying to say that we're counting mutations that aren't being inherited, called somatic mutations, and that is why we're getting such a fast clock. They're admitting that that is not the case, and that is not true. Even one of the biggest critics of Nathaniel Jensen's work has stated, when you compare the two different regions, the D loop and the mutation rate of the entire mitochondria, and you line them up from his own study, the Ding et al., that it is true that these approximately match. So you can't just say, oh, it's just Nathaniel Jensen's results that's skewing everything. It's just another creationist lying to you, when they match the secular studies that aren't young earth creation oriented whatsoever. All of these studies, the people believe in evolution, and yet they're getting young earth creation results. So the coalescence agrees with exactly what we would expect, because as you can tell, we're using Mendel's accountant on our model, and Mendel's accountant takes into consideration these variants. And when the NIH, which is the National Institute of Health, when they want to use a simulation, what are they using? They're not using some evolutionary assumption-based model. They're using the young earth creation simulator right here, which shows that deep time cannot be true because of the waiting time problem. And it shows how rapidly mutation and cancer spreads through a population. Why aren't they using some evolutionary model? Because it's not true. Listen what they wrote. Mendel's accountant can simulate with unprecedented biological accuracy the results of this accumulation. The simulation has shown the extinction of the human race only after 350 generations. If these result is anywhere close to correct, that humanity's genetic mutations would have led to extinction within 350 generations, how could it possibly fit with the evolutionary timeline? It can't. That's what they're running into, is into a wall. And when we look at how long it takes for beneficial mutations to become fixed, this is called the waiting time problem. You can see on the very chart, you're waiting 84 million years for just 2 mutations to be fixed. It can't be possible, everyone. So coalescence is taken into a consideration. Now, look at all these studies right here. I made this chart nice and easy for everybody to see. Mutation rates and substitution rates over here. going all the way back to the early 90s, all the way up to 2015, we have a range for mitochondrial Eve living between 4,000 and 10,000 years ago. Nothing even remotely close going back to a bottleneck 200,000 years ago. So that's why they invent their stories, right? So we have the substitution rate right over here on the side. It's a nice little picture cheat sheet for everybody. But what about Neanderthal and their substitutions? Well, let's think about that for a minute. Look at this. We observed a similar number in Neanderthal, which was 20, and humans 18. So they only have 2 more than us. So what's going on? How could they have just 2 more than us? Because what would be the average in a Neanderthal? Look at that. We find 8 substitutions plus or minus 3. That's the average amount of substitutions. But wait a minute. They tell us that Neanderthals lived for 400,000 years, and humans have only existed 200,000 years. Do you see the problem with this? That means that human beings living in a population for 150,000 years before we broke out of Africa, we were getting substitutions up to 20, and then we kind of plateaued, right? What do we see with Neanderthal? Well, how in the world could it possibly be true then that Neanderthal have fewer substitutions than humans when they lived in a smaller population of just under 20 for 400,000 years? They should have a minimum, a bare minimum of 40 at least. And we're talking they have a much smaller size. Now, remember, a population substitution fixation is based on population size. What's going to take longer for one of these people to walk to the top of this pyramid or to walk to the top of the smaller one? Obviously, it's going to take a lot shorter of a time to reach the top of this one. Well, that's how fixation works. You get a mutation. If the population is small, only, let's say, 15 people here, well, it doesn't take long for it to spread through the population until everybody has a fixed mutation in that region. That's how substitution works. We can explain this from Adam and Eve going to the Noble Flood bottleneck. Then there's a small population because people were all living together until the Tower of Babel. Then they disperse. So there's a good 1,000 years at least of rapid substitutions reaching fixations in populations and people groups, which we're going to get into in a minute. But this is better explained from our model about exactly what's going on and how fast and readily it can happen in a population. I cover all of this in the book, The True Mutation Rates. So let's look at a chart that was made by Howell in 2003, I believe. He said, this is what we observe, and we don't find anything in between, but yet this is what is estimated based on evolution being true. What's going on here? Why is this here? What's the problem? Can anyone solve this? Besides assumptions, nobody's been able to resolve it whatsoever because you need evidence to resolve something. They throw out hypotheses and stories all the time, but this problem still exists. What we observe is the exact opposite of what is estimated to be true, and they can't figure out why. And it's so simple. The story is not true. That's why. It's really just that simple, guys. This one says it all right here. We find that the mutation rate is approximately consistent per year and largely similar among genes. Ooh, look at that. I dare say, are they admitting something here? Look at this. Now we read what the study states about the lowest rates they obtained. You will notice that even the slowest rate they can honestly allow for is twice as fast as the common phylogenetic estimates. So based on pedigree studies, under the most conservative assumptions, we can conclude that HVR1 mutation rate from the Costa Rican population, which is about a 95% probability, fall between 2.75 times 3. Oh, look at that fast substitution rate there. In other words, the lower limit of our estimate is approximately twice as high as the most commonly accepted phylogenetic estimate. Isn't that unbelievable? Their slowest rate, they can't even possibly get that close to it. I like this one right here. This was written by Ann Gibbons. Of course, she wrote at the very ending what we read earlier. Eve would be a mere 6,000 years old with what they found from these clocks. Now, here's the funny part. This is what's concerning them. For example, researchers have calculated that mitochondrial Eve, the woman whose mtDNA was ancestral to all living people, lived 100,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago in Africa. Using the new clock, she would be a mere 6,000 years old. Now listen, pay attention. No one thinks that's the case, right? Because they believe in evolution. But at what point should our models switch from one mtDNA time zone to another? I'm worried. Yes, you should be worried. You should all be worried if you believe in evolution, because you're believing in a fairy tale. That's why you're throwing out selection and all these other random things in hopes and in dreams that you're still related to a sponge. Next, the evolutionary dates are clearly dependent on many tenuous assumptions. Oh my gosh, they admitted that. Really? What else are they going to admit? Uh-oh. There's a general perception that there is a competition to get the oldest date, and there's kudos in it. Oh, could it be if they can prove evolution, they're actually going to get raises and benefits and more notoriety and be in more magazines? You bet they are. And that's their incentive and that's their drive. It's not about truth. It's not about evidence. It's about proving their fable correct so they can get more grant money and pat each other on the back. That's what's going on here. So reading the entrails of chickens, guess what they found on their molecular clock when they were looking at it, trying to say, let's view this from our evolutionary advancement. Despite their allure, we must sadly conclude that all divergence estimates, divergence from a common ancestor, discussed here are without merit. Our advice to the reader is, whenever you see a time estimate in the evolutionary literature, demand uncertainty. Do people ever demand uncertainty that believe in evolution? Of course they don't. They're immediately defensive against it. Matter of fact, they get mad at you when you tell them they were lied to, and then they go and defend the liar. That's how crazy they are. So they're being even told, like, to demand uncertainty. There's no truth to any of this. What's going on here? It's all over the place. This evolutionary nonsense. It's just stories. So question it, look into it, investigate it. And we just had Darwin's Day happen. And guess what? They didn't question anything. I was on social media challenging people. Question this. All you would get is hate. That's how crazy these people are. They've lost their minds. So what do we see? Creation versus evolution. We get evolutionary phylogenetic rates all over the board, all trying to prove deep time evolution right here, all trying to point at those dates. Then we get the absolute observable dates from pedigree mutation rates, and they all agree with creation timeline, rapidly fast. Isn't that amazing? What we observe matches what we believed the Bible to say, according to the genealogies and the timeline. What are the odds of that? They could have been anything. They could have been 50,000 years old. That would have been confusing for evolution, but that would have been devastating for us. But yet it doesn't match that. And nothing does. When we look in animals, we find the same thing. Nathaniel Jensen pulled up studies that were done on fruit flies and worms. And what is this thing? A water flea. The rates are fast. The mutation rate's rapid in all of these different things. They did a pedigree rate on chickens. It's the exact same thing as humans, 15 times faster than it should be. Well, what's going on here? I thought chickens were related to dinosaurs. What is their mutation rate going back only 6,000, 7,000 years? What's it doing? Maybe it went into the bottleneck of Noah's flood and came out, and the mutation and the mitochondria was reset. Could it be possible? Of course it is. Then we get into these sweeping gene surveys that also countered any predictions that were ever done by Darwinism. 90% of all animal life, genetically speaking, the same age. They didn't expect to look over and see aquatic life and land life all exactly the same. Another unexpected find of the study was species have clear genetic boundaries. They have independent lines of ancestry going all the way down independently. There's no convergence on these common ancestors going back in time. And the absence of in-between species is something that also perplexed Darwin. Like, he looked in the fossil record and said, where are they? I don't see these intermediaries. They should be everywhere. There's hundreds of millions of years for them. Can't find them. And then they just say, oh, fossils are rare. Another excuse, right? This conclusion is very surprising, and I fought against it as hard as I could. They were literally fighting themselves in their own mind because it was so devastating to evolution. Of course, they have their own rescue devices, and of course, they'll never go to bed sleeping at night thinking that they weren't true. But look at this. 90% of all animal life appear at the same time. This debunks much about what we know about today about the evolution of species. You're right, it does. It's because this whole concept is nonsense. It's not even true. And when we look at Neanderthal, for example, what do we find? What side of the bottleneck are they on? Well, look at this. Their genome in the CO1 gene matches ours identically. So they had to be on this side of the bottleneck, because if they were before the bottleneck and genetic diversity broke it apart, and well, this would not be nearly identical. Look, there's only 6 mutations separating us from them in this region. That's nothing. And then when we look at human beings and gorillas, why don't we converge with them going deep into the past? Look how close this is, genetic similarity. Well, the genetic similarity being this high is devastating with what you just learned about how fast mutation rates are. On the bottom, you can see all the differences from mutations separating gorilla. But at the top, you see all of the differences that are non-mutation that are separating us from the gorilla. Those are created differences. And that's how we know we don't converge on them going back into the past. That's why we see independent lines of ancestry for all of these different things in genetics and in the fossil record. They lose their mind when you say that, but that is exactly what this study showed. And that's exactly what we would expect and what we predicted. And it's what we found.
How far back do people actually go? Huh? Can you trace your grandparents back to actual human beings? Are you tracing them back to animals? Are you tracing them back to anything other than human? I think the answer is pretty obvious. And yes, pedigree rate studies have been done on animals. The same results occur. Pedigree rates much faster than phylogenetic assumption rates. We look at not a lot of things obviously have been tested because they don't like the results. So they just stick to their made up phylogenetic version. But every single time the results come back with creation, they don't show evolution any way, shape, or form, no matter what they do. Yeah, they have rescue devices like, well, maybe mutation rates were faster in the past, and oh, maybe selection was stronger, or maybe this, maybe that, maybe that. Yep, again, more rescue devices. Nothing in science can confirm or what they're saying. None of it. So it's actually evolution versus science, not creation versus evolution. There's a big difference. So always remember that.
Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist.
That's right. Without evolution, atheists have no grounding to stand on. That's why they need it to be true. They have an obligation for it to be true. They have to have it. So we don't care. Like I said, there is no reason that young earth creation has to be true for salvation purposes. There's plenty of Christians that don't believe in young earth creation, and it doesn't even matter for salvation. So why in the world would we believe it? How about because the evidence always points to it? So how about molecular clocks? Do they actually tick at different rates? Evolution says no. We say absolutely. Not only do they tick at different rates, they actually tick at different rates within the same species, even within different human beings. That's why when we look at charts like this, which is the Y chromosome and the mitochondria, they have different stars like this that shoot out, and different people groups have different mutations because they mutate at different rates. That's why these charts exist. So that's what comes to another prediction. Nathaniel Jensen said, I predict that most African groups will be found to mutate in their DNA almost 2 times faster than reported with what we see in other people groups today. So that's why we can trace them back to Noah's 3 daughter-in-laws, but there's different webs that shoot out from them that look like different periods of time. So is there any evidence? Because, a lot of people go, well, it's hypothetical, because we always say, recombination rates, they're higher in Africans. So that's probably why we got evidence from that one. Here's a couple studies that show that there's different hotspots and that African populations have more recombination hotspots, and that given that recombination rates vary between species and even individuals, it is possible that hotspots could also differ among ethnically different populations, including Africans. Indeed, the identification of haplogroups and genes associated with recombination rates could occur at different frequencies in HapMat populations, which raises the possibility that populations' specific genetic variants may influence recombination rates. So yeah, we got evidence from there. We also have evidence that there's overall point mutations are faster in Africans. Then we obviously have the fixation rate would be higher because of smaller populations. And then we don't just have that evidence. We literally have evidence in pedigree studies that show, guess what? People do mutate at different rates. This goes all the way back to 2 different studies back in Parsons in 1997 and 1998, who actually showed that the Amish people mutate at a slower rate than the rest of other people. And he took a bunch of different Amish families from around America and tested them and found that they mutate 14% slower than other people that were tested in the same study. So you go, if they can mutate slower, then obviously Jensen is making a prediction that they could mutate faster. And then, but that's not it. Another study was also done looking at a particular family in a region that was that showed a bunch of different families of the same descent in one isolated region, and they mutated 7% slower than the other Europeans that were around them. So yes, if even different people groups can mutate at different rates. And this is one of the reasons that they have different phylogenetic charts, because think about it. If you throw a bunch of cats together and we say all cats go back to a single common ancestor, then how can these cats all have different phylogenetic trees? How come some look older than other ones? We answer that easily through generation times, because some have high generation times, others have low generation times. So it builds a different phylogenetic chart because they believe that everything mutates at the same rate. There's a study that Donnie and I did on that particular subject, and you guys can find it by typing in the invalidation of the molecular clock neutral theory. But we have traced animals all the way back. Wolves go back to a single common ancestor. So we know that they're all related. We can do the same thing with humans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutan. Guess what? They would be constructed a phylogenetic chart like this. But we know this chart isn't true because there's no way it actually could be true, because we all came out of a bottleneck. And if a bottleneck is true, which we know it is, and they admit now today that it is true, then there is no possible way that they could ever build this chart based on what we know in the mitochondria or the Y chromosome, because a bottleneck resets genetic diversity. So they can never actually prove genetic relation. So why does one look older than the next? Again, it comes down to the orangutan or the pongo only having a generation time of 11 years. So a gorilla and a chimp is going to look twice as young as they are, because they have had half the generation time living. And then a human, an extra 10 years on top of it. So human's going to look the youngest in any phylogenetic chart because they have the highest amount of generation time, which means there hasn't been that many generations alive to pass on that many mutations. So therefore, we would have the least amount of mutations. So therefore, it's always going to be constructed different on each different person, on different groups of people. And it's all dependent on situation, not time. It's like where did they live? Were they hypermutating? Were they isolated in smaller groups? Were they expanding in groups? Did they live in cold regions? Did they live in warm regions? And knowing this makes it really important, because when we're looking at, let's say, flightless birds, these are all southern hemisphere birds, which means they all live down south. So when they got off the ark, none of them went north. We would expect that in our model because it's freezing cold. Everything that's going to do really good and try to survive is going to go south, in Australia, in Africa, where they could try to stay warm. Humans didn't do it because they were inherited lands that they couldn't go to, right? Ham inherited the south, so other people weren't allowed to go in Africa. So they went into other regions, but animals didn't know any better. They just went where they could survive. So in this, we get a phylogenetic chart that's built off of the assumption of evolution being true. Then flightless birds would match the nearest landmass to them, because they would have walked from the landmass onto an island and then been isolated. So that's their assumption based on evolution being true. We would say that no, animals lose the ability to flight. There's also land bridges. So these two examples are going to refute the phylogenetic chart. Guess what? In fact, that is exactly what happened. They built the phylogenetic chart based on common ancestry being true, and that the local land mass animal is going to be the one that's the closest on the island. And look at that. It was a real surprise that the elephant bird was more closely related to kiwis. It was a completely unexpected. No matter which animal you look at on that chart, it is completely contradictory to the chart that they made. None of those birds actually match that phylogenetic chart of ancestry. Matter of fact, the exact opposite is true. You look at what they related and you put at the end of the tips of those branches, and the exact opposite is true. And that brings us to our next prediction, which is a novel prediction by us here at Team Standing for Truth. Donnie and I were looking here at the phenotypic diversity of people in the world. Now, remember, we would say that there was an equal distance between all people, because all people are the same age, meaning all people group formed from that group of people that dispersed from the Tower of Babel not very long ago. Evolution would predict, no, Africans were alive in Africa, stuck there for hundreds of thousands of years, or 150,000 years at least. And then later, Europeans came, and then Asians branched off. So that would make a hierarchy with Europeans and Asians being more similar and more distant to Africans, with a hierarchical pattern of Africans looking far more similar than either of them. So phenotypic diversity, our phenotypes, are the observable measurements and characteristics. You can measure the face and any characteristic that we want, and then compare them to something. So that's what a phenotype is, just so you guys know, because we're about to get into this pretty deep right now. So we would say that Ham, Shem, and Japheth broke off from each other, and they started diversifying in phenotypic diversity at equal times. So if we were to look at something phenotypically, we would see no hierarchical patterns. We would see a genetic similarity in phenotypic diversity, about the same. Evolution wouldn't do that, right? Evolutionary model would predict that humans arose out of Africa, and they have a problem with this, right? Because they assume that because Africans have the highest amount of genetic diversity, they're the oldest. Therefore, they would have the highest amount of phenotypic diversity to match this genetic diversity. However, this isn't the case. So they wrote, it is the key challenge of human genetics to figure out this paradox. So when we looked and we compared the different people groups and we split them down the middle and we start comparing, we find equal phenotypic diversity between everyone. Now that's very unique and very unexpected for the evolutionary thing. That's why it's a paradox. It's a confusing thing that they're having to go, what can we do about this? There are differences between every, what they would like to call, race of people. All right. But this is where the fixation index comes in. You can take the most diverse group of people and they have the phenotypic diversity that's exactly the same in wild animals today. And they also are very similar looking. So that brings us to like, wait a minute, if these animals lived over great vast amounts of time, how come they are so close to phenotypic diversity? What's going on there? And we're going to get into that. But first, let's compare human beings, okay? So I want you to look at the human, gorilla, chimpanzee, pongo, and then the human, right? So look at the phenotypic diversity. So you can see the humans are very, very different. Very high amounts of phenotypic diversity in human beings, but not in the animal kingdom. So what's going on here? These species are all related to one another, right? So supposedly these have existed for millions of years longer than human beings, but yet they have less phenotypic diversity. That's not expected. So again, look at humans in comparison. We have the lowest amount of genetic diversity out of all these animals, but yet the highest amount of phenotypic diversity. This tells us that we're not related to them at all. The common ancestor between humans and chimps would have carried the genetic diversity capable of giving them, both chimps and humans, high phenotypic diversity capabilities. Yet they want us to believe that humans inherited it, but the chimpanzees didn't inherit that same phenotypic diversity. Why not? That makes no sense at all. We literally split. We would share the same amount of genetics that would allow diversity. So we can see that the phenotypic diversity is the same between all of these different species, including humans, right? So what does that tell us? It tells us many important things. One, that all human groups must be the same age, as their phenotypic diversity is the same between all people groups. Two, it tells us that phenotypic diversity between animal species is also the same, meaning that we all went through a recent bottlenecks and animals species formed soon after that, and not in the deep past, right? Because deep time obviously would be letting us know that a lot of phenotypic diversity would occur over millions of years. It also tells us that humans have the same phenotypic diversities between Asians, Caucasians, Africans. And this is what we would expect with the biblical account of creation, biblical flood, I'm sorry. And if hundreds of thousands of years had actually passed, life would be far more phenotypically diverse in some species, but not in others that they're related to, right? There is no phenotypic hierarchy either, right? So we look at these, we go, look, tigers, all of them can interbreed, all are related. Very low phenotypic diversity. You would look at one and be like, I can't even tell the difference between a Bengal tiger and a Siberian tiger. If I was in the wild, it would take a specialist. It would take somebody that knows the species to identify that. And same with the orangutan. But humans, very, very different, very diverse. We line up the animals. We can actually see the same thing. And then we go, but look at just Africans. Look at how different, right? We can see that the diversity within Africans is still really, really diverse. It's the same thing no matter where we look in different people groups today. And these are people groups from all around the world. We can see massive phenotypic differences looking at the skulls. very, very unique, very different than the animal kingdom. And again, more Africans. That was supposed to be showed earlier. Phenotypic diversity off the charts, but yet the same between every single one of us. So keep in mind, those images do not even include people groups that have died out in the past, like Denisovan, Neanderthal, Erectus, Heidelbergensis, which also show even more phenotypic diversity, which would be expected in the past, right? We get closer to Noah, higher amounts of genetic diversity, more diversity will be seen as time goes on, get lost, right? So yet, and this is what we see. I showed this because it looks pretty funny. Look at all the diversity we have from dog breeds today. Okay. Why is this? What's going on here? Right? Dog breeds are something that hide the genetic diversity within them. Okay. We know that. So we're going to get into that in just a minute. But first, this is what we would see. If evolution was true, we would find the highest genetic phenotypic diversity in African people today, and that phenotypic diversity would be hugely uncorrelated. And then we get into the Europeans, which would be more close to the Asians, right? That's what we would see in phenotypic diversity. So instead, what do we see? We see the exact equal proportions between all groups of people, exactly what we would expect in a biblical model. But an evolutionary model has us going bottleneck to bottleneck to bottleneck to bottleneck. Each one of these bottlenecks would be lowering genetic diversity every single time we go into one, because you only get a handful of people surviving each one. So we would, if we looked into the fossil record in the past, we should see massive phenotypic differences between all these supposed human ancestors. And the phenotype, because if we see that with people groups today, which would be at the end of the spectrum, we would find that the phenotypic differences would be minimal in what people would be able to produce today. But instead we see the opposite. We see massive amounts of phenotypic differences looking at the populations, and we look over at people groups in the past, and we don't see that in the fossil record. We go, oh man, there's not really much going on there. Why? If they live for hundreds of thousands of years, and where are the corpses? Where are the bodies? Where are all the differences? I think our model makes far more sense with what we see when it comes to this phenotypic difference. So again, when we're looking over here at this one, we see that if all three major groups of people formed soon after the flood, sometime after Babel, then all of this finally makes sense. And they have this hierarchical pattern that should be there. And this is where the paradox came from, and why they really came with, like, well, people look so different. Let's compare them to the closest looking animal. That must have been what happened. Asians, that's where the Pongo live. They're over there in Asia. So they must have come from that ancestral group of primates. And then what do we know? Well, we know from genotypic studies now, race is a made up thing. There's the genetic similarity between all people is extremely close. We're not related to these animals whatsoever. And then comes the storytelling from them. That's like, well, what happened is we got these chimps, right? These primate ancestors, and they had full body fur. The chimpanzees kept theirs, and we started to lose ours. Kind of like there's chimps that lost their fur today. And eventually what's going to happen is they're going to evolve melanin, and then they're going to evolve this subcutaneous layer of fat that's going to surround their body. And then they're going to get goosebumps because it'll help keep them warm. They'll evolve all eyebrows, and then they'll evolve the ability to grow long hair on the tops of their heads, and then they'll evolve a thick epidermis skin, and then thermal regulating genes. All of these requirements are needed also so that we can start wearing fur again like our ancient ancestors, because that makes total sense, right? And yeah, these things are all true. Only humans have these features about them. If you want the list, it's right there. And just remember, guys, that there's not a lot of time, because the amount of time it takes only 2 mutations to reach fixation, beneficial mutations, is 200 million years. So they have to account for all of these things literally to evolve in the time it took to split, which is 6 million years. But only 2 mutations takes that long. So where is the time for evolution to evolve all of those things? We're not even going to get into the how long a sexual organ would take to evolve. That's going to be far more than 2 mutations. So it gets more ridiculous the more the story you look at it. So another way we can validate that deep time is not true using this phenotypic diversity is by looking at man made current animals and breeds, right? Let's use modern created dog breeds as an example. They are far outside the phenotypic diversity compared to the wild counterparts, right? Look at their faces, either completely fat, smashed flat, really long. Some of them can't even breathe. They have all kinds of diversity within that group because we've manipulated their genetics. So we can see how much we can change their genetics around. Breeding has shown that it has a hidden reservoir inside this genetic capability, but wild animals don't show much diversity. If deep time was really true, wouldn't we see the story that they admit to? Because if we look, they say that the wolf has lived almost 1 million years. Well, wait a minute. That story reminds me of something. It reminds me of the story of where they said the Pachycetus evolved into an aquatic species in the same amount of time. Wait a minute. That's a huge amount of phenotypic differences. But yet they want us to believe that the wolf had that same amount of time, diverse and spread around the world, and yet almost no phenotypic differences whatsoever. Wait a minute. The story doesn't match what the science is telling us. Why? Because the story they're telling us is a lie. It's stupid. It doesn't make any sense. Adam Segwid said the reason why evolution, the theory of evolution was created from the first to the last is the dish of rank materialism cleverly cooked up. And why is it done? For no other reason, I am sure, except for the independent of a creator. People know that they invented this. They know that if you push evolution, naturalism, that there is no need for a God. That's the reason they have to push this nonsense, because it just goes against Occam's razor, right? In science, the authority of 1,000 opinions is not worth as much as one tiny spark of reason in an individual man. So don't ever let people tell you, well, the majority believe it. Are they all wrong? Who cares what they think? Think for yourself. Question everything. That's what science is about. Stop just accepting what everyone is like. Oh, well, the scientist told me it's true. Well, I'm just going to believe them. That's what they told me in school. Okay, well, they're going to tell you a lot of things. If you lived 1,000 years ago, you'd believe the earth is flat too. So consensus then as well. Are you going to go with that same argument? Doesn't make much sense. How about evolution? They say linear line going up through time. We say, wait a minute, mutations are breaking us down. We see the exact opposite. We say created genetic diversity. We see creation in animal species, right? But again, beneficial mutations have to override negative mutations for it to be true. So when we're looking at our model, which would say genetic entropy, we're looking at damage in the genome, right? Kimura came along and he was like, and see what's going on, how much selection would actually be needed for going on. And what we see is that Kimura only assumed that beneficial mutations could completely override things through simulations. He didn't actually know. So what we actually found out later is most of the mutations that are building up are actually taking place within this distribution area where they can't be selected for. So this is another one. I think I was going to cover going through genetic entropy for a minute. It might take too long, so I'll just skim through it because you guys kind of know a little bit about it. But as you guys know, we have multiple mutations building up that are non-selectable, non-seeable, but yet we haven't reached mutation saturation. We see that problems are arising, diseases are increasing. We don't see what they expected to see. And when we look for these beneficial mutations, they just infer that some could happen, but there's not enough, guys. There just really isn't. The great majority of them, 99%, are harmful in some way, shape, or form. And when we look at things like in Africa, we go, ooh, look at that. There's malaria. Malaria is taking place, and this isn't good. I mean, 300,000 babies are born with sickle cell, and 50 to 90% will die before their 5th birthday. So yeah, it's true they don't get malaria, but they're dying from this mutation anyway. So it's helping, but it's like, hurting yourself just so it could happen. Just so it can help a little bit. It's like evolution's just trying to make you survive, basically. But that's all that's happening, is barely any survival. So we see a buildup of these new mutations every single generation, and it's based on the age of the father. And now we're starting to really learn that, wait a minute, most of these silent mutations are harmful. They're not neutral.
And that is unexpected at a point of where they say that 75% of synonymous, which they always thought synonymous mutations don't have any effect on something at all, are actually harmful. That was really, really surprising. And what we know now is that these random mutations, they even admit that they're not leading to the type of evolution that they need it to in the textbooks. Because remember, they can say evolution can do anything. It can go left, it can go right, it can go up, it can go down. Well, that's not what the textbooks show. The textbooks show a linear form of evolution. So that's what they have to prove. Don't ever let them tell you otherwise, because it's just absolutely ridiculous. And too long to go over some of these. And most of the things that they actually thought were beneficial mutations are more epigenetically regulated than anything else. And epigenetics doesn't even change the gene, and mutations are what change the gene. And if it doesn't change the gene, there's no evolution. So epigenetics is a really good subject. It's a fun one. It really shows the limit for what we thought evolution really have. Then we have the waiting time problem, where again, another huge subject, where there's just not enough time for evolution to be true when we go through the simulation of DNA changes required based on mutations, beneficial mutations, rising and reaching fixation. It's just not there. So we show that the waiting time problem is very severe when one or more mutations is required to establish any new function. And evolution needs new function everywhere you look. If you're going to turn something into the ability to fly in multiple different organisms in every single different environment, you're going to need massive amounts of new functions to get there. So we're able to actually predict that there's the loss of function, and that loss of function, we're able to say, if we're losing chromosomes over time from chromosome fusions, we can make testable predictions on that. And therefore, we can actually trace back lineages based on where animals migrated to, how much farther they got away from the ark, and then trace those back to more of a chromosome count, and therefore it performs in the function of showing us that the biblical model of ancestry is more true, and giving us an indicator of what animals were probably on the ark, rather than their counterpart species that later came about. And we can do that by tracing chromosome fusions. That's in the young Earth creation model. And then Dr. John Sanford came out and said that he hypothesized that the humans will go extinct after 350 generations. And as you know from the Y chromosome, we're about at 150 right now. So that puts a time limit on humans and pretty much all life in general. But that doesn't tell us anything except for more testable predictions. And again, Mendel's accountant is the simulator that was run for this. And a lot of people don't like Mendel's accountant that are atheists, because it completely destroys their paradigm of evolution being true. And they say, who cares about Mendel's accountant? Well, I'll tell you who cares about it. The National Institute of Health, the NIH, the largest health organization on Earth. They don't use the evolutionary model. They use the young Earth creation model, because it is the true model. It doesn't care about the fight that we're having between creation and evolution. It only cares about what works. And if evolution worked, they would be using an evolutionary model of prediction, and it doesn't. It uses ours, because ours is what's true. It's what we see. It's what we can test. It's what we observe. And it's the one we're making testable predictions on. So why are they choosing the young Earth creation model if it's wrong? If they say, oh, it's garbage. Oh, really? Oh, it's garbage, is it? They're using it with success, and they don't care about the debate going on. So that's destructive. And the final conclusions is beneficial mutations can't keep up with the deleterious ones. They're not strong enough to override it. And if they are strong enough to override it, it actually makes things worse, because it speeds up the negative ones, which I forgot to show you the slide on. That brings us to the next one. Genome studies confirm creation, or do the genome studies force evolution into early retirement, right? Do we have genetic boundaries, or are these genetic relations that they're talking about by looking at particular areas of the genome and protein coding region genes? Is that showing us? Well, that's what the Rockefeller University study of 2019 actually showed us, is that it showed us that there were clear genetic boundaries, and that you can trace these things back to a bottleneck, and there's no species in between them at all. That was exactly the opposite of what they expected. They expected a hierarchical pattern going back to a universal common ancestor. Instead, they found linear lines of a separate ancestry coming out of a bottleneck. Humans, fish, chimpanzees, gorillas, all of them at the same time coming out of the same bottleneck. All of the things that they said, no, we converge. No evidence for any of it. And the evidence, they said, was so surprising that they fought against it. That's right. They had to
They had to tell themselves like, whoa, what's going on here? So again, all animals the same age? That's right. They were the same age. 90% of all life, genetically speaking, is the same age. And that means 10% of all life that was in the past went into a bottleneck, and boom, 90% now that we all have came from that 10% that was on the ark. Guess what evolution did not predict? Exactly that. And yes, that's right. The population included anchovies too. That's right. Fish went through the bottleneck. So they can't say, the bottleneck was just some, random thing that was for land life, or maybe it was just a volcano that wiped out some things. Oh no, global, completely global. And this debunked what they know about evolution of species. That's right. So they've tried to say, they had to go back and write on the top of that study, no, this doesn't debunk evolution, it confirms it. But guess what? It doesn't do that at all. It completely destroys their theory. And if you want even more on that, make sure to watch the video called Genetic Boundaries on this channel. Go back. I recommend it. It's very, very powerful, because what we see are living species going back in a single line of ancestor to exactly the same species of the family, right? And then a branching out from that, exactly what the biblical model predicted. That's why phylogeny has to use cladistics as play words and games, and all they use is assumptions, right? They have to use cladistics as their word salad game to prove relation now, because that's the only way they can do it, right? They've lost everything, so now they have to use semantics. They have to go, well, we're related to apes because we are apes. We named ourselves that. So now we can say that we are apes. Oh, okay. So here's the assumptions that are based on cladistics. They require assumptions based on it. Carl Linnaeus, he based groupings on similarities of traits, right? But Darwin classified these based on the assumptions of ancestry. That's the difference. The animals stayed the same, but the lenses they used to interpret it have changed because of the classification systems and the assumption of evolution being true. What do we see? Carl Linnaeus was in many ways, none of the least of which was how he classified humans. He named humans Homo sapiens and placed them in the genus Homo. Although Linnaeus believed that humans were a specially designed God's creation, he plotted them like he would any other animal. So Linnaeus did not recognize humans alongside of apes with any idea of evolutionary link at all. He did this with the same reasoning he used to categorize all life, which is similarities that he identified with species. That is it. It doesn't mean that it's true. It doesn't mean that evolution is true. It's just like, oh, you have a hand and an arm that can do this. You have a face that's forward. You don't have a tail. You're an ape. Close enough. So therefore, people will go, oh, I guess I'm an ape. Oh, I'm gonna classify that way. I might as well be an ape, right? Here is the definition of a human. It's a human being distinguished from an animal. I'm sorry to tell you guys. That's just the way that it's going to have to be for you.
Homology is not evidence for evolution. The original prediction on homology is not an evolutionary one, but a biblical creation prediction. Homology itself is the concept that similar anatomical features portray universal common ancestry. But is that really the case? Today, you are going to learn that it is the exact opposite. So buckle up and get ready to have your mind blown. Evolutionary homology-based predictions were based on the idea that features produced by similar genetic sequences are phylogenetically homologous. Exceptions to this prediction, that the concept of genetic homology cannot be said to be the rule but the exception. Since that is true, what does that mean for the fossil record and phylogeny, or the textbooks themselves that have been teaching this for decades? Well, it means that they're all arbitrarily lining up things to prove common ancestry, which can all be thrown out, because homology itself points to a creator, and the concept was plagiarized by Charles Darwin from a creationist named Sir Patrick Owens. And we're going to take a look at the entire fossil record in this video, then specific evolutionary chains like bird evolution, whale evolution, and human evolution, just to expose that they cannot make an evolutionary chart anymore based on homology, because the genetic evidence falsifies homology-built charts. So, to reiterate, they can no longer assume common ancestry based on homology in the fossil record. Since it obviously doesn't work today and doesn't align with the genetic evidence, then trying to mix the two together, known as phylogenetics, has actually made problems worse for them rather than solve their already existing problems. Since the data now confirms that homology and genetic similarity no longer confirm one another, the evolutionary tree of life falls apart. Think about it. If the bones of a human arm evolved from the same precursors as the flipper of a whale and the leg of a dog, as evolution teaches, then we should be able to trace those alleged homologies to the DNA that codes for them. This prediction has failed. So they have fallen back onto a newer concept called convergent evolution to help save the day. But does it actually save them? No. It just hand waves away the entire problem, ignoring the elephant in the room. Take, for example, the gene that controls the mouse eye color, which also happens to control the mouse physical size. But the same gene in a fruit fly that controls the same eye color does not control the fruit fly's size, but rather has a secondary function on the female sex organ morphology. Completely different. Some geneticists thought this knowledge would allow them to find the chemical formula needed to produce an arm, a leg, or other structures. But once biologists acquired a greater understanding of genetics, they found what are labeled as homologous structures in different species often are produced by quite different genes. The biblical creation model predicted functional differences through common design long ago, and that is what we see. A single code from a single designer in all of life. Sonar genes in dolphins match that in bats, yet they share no common ancestor in the remote past. And these are one of the reasons they had to invent convergent evolution as a rescue device. But it doesn't save them when it comes to common ancestry looking at the fossil record, which is constructed using only homology and not genetics. So clearly you can see the problem and the impossible hurdle they need to overcome. So we have no precursor common ancestor to bats, whales, birds, primates, cats, sloth, armadillos, humans. The list literally goes on and on. We only have independent lines of ancestry, not only seen in the fossil record, but genetics as well, just as the Bible describes. And no amount of made-up SpongeBob storytelling will save them from these facts. Only their deep indoctrinated mind or anti-biblical young earth creation stance would even remotely allow somebody to hold onto this pagan lie of evolution theory once they've been exposed to the truth. So let me break this down for you. Pay attention. The reason homology does not match genetics is because evolution is not true. That is why the patterns break down. And that is why homology is not good evidence for evolution, but rather for creation. Let me make that clear to you one more time. The reason things line up so well via homology is because all life has the same designer, and just as any human designer would use the same base model to branch off of in making new designs, so did God. Since we are created in His image, it makes sense that we would copy these patterns and can find them in nature. So the reason homology makes such a pattern is because this is expected if there was a single creator designing all life, and that is why it was originally a biblical creationist to predict such a pattern of design in nature. And we know that this pattern breaks down when we add genetics to the equation because evolution is not true. Only the pattern of created design with independent lines of ancestry is what we see. There is no convergence going back in time, and only through their cherry picking of particular parts of the genome can they even remotely build evolutionary trees. And in comparing them, they also break down and contradict one another. So in closing, homology, which refers to the similarity in structures between different species, does not align with genetics, which is known as phylogeny. Therefore, if homology and genetics do not agree with one another, then it is falsified, which means it is worthless for evidence for evolution. Plain and simple. This discrepancy shows that the concept of evolution is not true. They cannot make a consistent tree of life even when cherry-picking the data and ignoring others. This falsifies the fossil record and universal common ancestry. What about all the evolutionary charts that are based on the fossil record? Does that not show that homology works and that can be traced back to a single common ancestor for all life? Well, actually, no, not at all.
and we will use their own charts and diagrams to let them refute themselves here real soon. But first, let me show you a nice little clip that I really enjoyed, and I think you will too.
So the question remains open, is homology due to common design or common descent? Because the argument was so central to Darwin's case, his followers eliminated the question by simply redefining the word from simple similarity to meaning similarity due to common ancestry. They baked Darwinism into the definition of the word. Homology now typically means similarity due to common ancestry. It's a clever way to end an argument if you can get away with it, but for anybody paying attention, it's a baldly circular one. Common ancestry because common ancestry.
We got a flag on the play, circular reasoning, illegal use of logic, 5-yard penalty, repeat the 4th grade.
Oh come on, no serious biologist could possibly make that mistake. Nobody defines homology that way and then uses it as evidence for evolution. Come on, people couldn't possibly be that dumb. The circular argumentation is still regularly used in high school, even college level textbooks, and many a YouTube video. The surprising thing is that many otherwise very smart people didn't realize this. However, more and more people are seeing the problem for what it is.
They have done the exact same thing with the geologic layers. You cannot even say the name of a single geologic layer without it portraying some imaginary time period. They have done an amazing job baking Darwinism into the proverbial cake, so to speak. It is in everything, and that is how they swindle it in to everything without making people even notice it. Why do we find some creatures with features of 2 different kinds? Isn't that a missing link? Actually, the examples of these things are so far and few in between that we can easily place them into their own kind. Think about it. The only examples they really have are Tiktaalik, which has features of a fish and amphibian, the bear dog, which obviously mixes the bear and the dog kind, Archaeopteryx, which mixes reptile and bird, and the famous Lucy, which has ape-like features and human. Take away these few examples and they're left with the majority of fossils being in stasis. If stasis is the theme and missing links are the exception, then why would we build the foundation of an entire theory around this rare exception? It should be the norm, don't you think? If they did go by the norm, then they would be left with the creationist model. So it makes sense why they can't. Now that we know that species adapt and change rapidly, how could we have so much stasis over supposed hundreds of millions of years? That wouldn't be possible at all. So, the rare exceptions, like the platypus, are best explained in our model, in that they are their own kind and have been classified as an ancestor. And evolutionists have taken these rare exceptions and classified them as an ancestor that was once a predecessor of 2 families. But we don't find any such convergence in the fossils nor in genetics, so why believe it other than storytelling? In his heyday, Sir Richard Owen's name was often spoken in the same breath as Isaac Newton. Today he is fairly unknown. After completing his medical education in 1825, Owen took a post at the Royal College of Surgeons in England. Through his work, he developed extensive knowledge on comparative anatomy and decided to pursue a scientific rather than medical career. Owen's scientific accomplishments are legendary. In addition to his pioneering work at museums and institutions for research and public education, he made key contributions in comparative anatomy and paleontology. Owen brought clarity to the concepts of homology and anatomy. And he used this knowledge of comparative anatomy to describe and interpret a large number of invertebrate and vertebrate fossils. As part of his work, he coined the term that we all know and use today as dinosaur. And he also played a key role in interpreting the first fossil bird, Archaeopteryx. Now, why am I talking so much about Sir Owens? Because most people have no idea who he is or how important his contributions are to biblical young earth creation, and how his work alone destroys evolution theory at its root. For example, it was him who formulated the idea of hierarchical patterns, and he made predictions based on this. It wasn't evolutionists. As a matter of fact, it was Darwin who plagiarized him. But more on that soon. Owens stated, "I never asserted that creation, or the appearance
of a new or modified fauna was not by law. But what law? Not, I may say, of natural transmutation, but by turning fishes into reptiles, whales into pachyderms, or monkeys into men, in the way of natural generation, but by a higher law, of which we may reach the conception hereafter, as you have reached the conception of an archetypal form. When Owen says that continuity is by law, he means that a person sees in the vertebrates, starting from fish and moving to amphibians, then to reptiles, then to mammals, and finally ending in man, should be viewed as a grounded plan laid out by God during creation, showing man is the pinnacle of creation, and that this pattern should not be understood by any law of evolution. Owen's model and predictions of continuity were built on something called the archetype. This archetype was an abstract idea from the mind of God, from which God himself built all vertebrates in a progressive sequence using the same program and expanding upon it for more diversity, which eventually converges on the pinnacle of God's creation, which is man. Darwin's inspiration for a single universal common ancestor comes from Owen himself and his ideas, and Darwin used Owen's archetype and made it into a real evolutionary ancestor for all vertebrates. I bet you didn't know that. It was Owen himself who even coined the modern definition of homology, and the concept is a creationist one, which was pre-evolutionary ideas. Owen provided the first framework to interpret anatomical and physiological similarities among organisms. Owen saw these mutual features as manifestations of a common blueprint. He defined the archetype in this way. That ideal, original, or fundamental pattern on which a natural group of animals or system of organs has been constructed, and to modifications of which the various forms of such animals or organs may be referred. So once again, we have a biblical young earth creationist predictions before the evolutionary predictions were even made. And like typical, they took it and use it now for evidence of evolution, and swindle it to support them. But the fact is, the evidence and predictions came from biblical creationists. We've unearthed millions of fossils around the world. So with all this evidence, so to speak, it's clear that the fossil record proves evolution, right? Well, actually, no. It didn't when Darwin was alive, and it hasn't since he's been gone. In fact, Chucky D himself knew this when he wrote the following: "Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. The explanation lies, as I believe, in the extreme imperfection of the geological record." Okay, but surely after all this time since Darwin, digging and discovering fossil after fossil, we have a much more perfect geological record that supports evolution, right? Nope, not even close. Listen to how two renowned evolutionary biologists summarized this truth. Instead of finding the slow, smooth, and progressive changes, they saw rapid bursts of change, new species appearing seemingly out of nowhere, and then remaining unchanged over supposed millions of years, patterns hauntingly reminiscent of creation. The fossil record doesn't show gradual change, and every paleontologist has known that ever since Cuvier, or however you're supposed to pronounce that. It's only the most indoctrinated evolutionist who believes that this is actual good evidence for evolution. And since it is actually some of the worst, what does that tell you about the rest of the evidence outside of the fossil record? Okay, I can go on and on, but there's always going to be opposing views, because both sides of the debate have the same evidence that can be interpreted through different worldviews. You gotta remember that, people. Facts don't say anything. People say things based on their interpretation of those facts, influenced by their worldview. But that's a whole nother subject, and I don't want to get into that right now. Instead, hey, let's have a little fun and take a look at some of the most popular secular articles and charts on the fossil record and see what we can learn to separate facts from interpretations of facts by asking a few simple questions. Question 1. Did the artist take artistic license with what I'm looking at here? Check this out, because this happens all the time. Look, isn't that sweet? So cute and fluffy. Okay, why do you think the artist made these creatures appear more human-like by throwing in the affectionate smile and depicting them hanging out like a human family, going on a picnic or something? Why did he even draw them walking upright? Why make these shapes and colors of their eyes more human than ape? Is any of this based on any actual fossil evidence? Of course not. But if you want the story of evolution to appear more convincing, you just might need to fill in some of those missing gaps with your presuppositional imagination. Just saying. Question 2. Is the attention-grabbing headline or title supported by actual facts? For instance, take a look at this popular book called Why Evolution is True. We don't have to go any further than the jacket on this, because on it you've got a dino evolving into a bird in 3 simple steps. There you go. But then, on the inside, it is written, and I kid you not, the jacket depicts a chronological sequence of fossils showing the evolution of birds. We do not know whether the actual line of descendant includes, wait for it, the first 3. Say what now? Doesn't that mean these 3 shouldn't be on the cover? Which means all you've got is an actual bird? Yup, no evolution, just a bird. Talk about worldview filling in the gaps. On to question 3. What do the graphics on evolutionary charts indicate? I mean, they sure look convincing. For instance, on this one, from the dinosaur book, you got solid red columns and white columns showing gradual progression over time. But let's read the almost incomprehensible 2-point font over here. It reads, tinted areas indicate solid fossil evidence, which means the white areas represent no fossil evidence, right? Okay then, take them away. Uh-oh, looks like a pattern hauntingly reminiscent of creation again, right from their own charts. This is common in all the textbooks. So again, just look for yourself. Where are all the common ancestors? Where's the convergence? Where are these missing links? They're missing entirely because they don't exist. They will always continue to be missing links. Are you starting to get the bigger picture now? Are you starting to see the lies and the misrepresentation of what they try to present to the public and kids? We literally have dinosaurs, as they are, arising out of nowhere, and staying dinosaurs until they go extinct. That's what we find. Exactly like creation would predict, and exactly like what we see. But that's not all. Let's look at herbivores and all of these different species. We have all the bovine, we have the giraffe, we have the hippopotamus, we have the hog, and you can notice, again, in the lines, the solid black lines are the fossil evidence of what we do have. The light gray, assumptions. We don't have any fossil evidence. So yet again, where are all these missing links? Where's the convergence to the common ancestors that supposedly produced all of these in the future? They're not there, just like every other chart. More made-up fables and myths, where they take the fossils that they do find and they rearrange them as though there's some type of a pattern. And when they find something first, they call it primitive. It's all subjective. That's all it is. Don't fall for it. What about bat evolution? When you look at a chart, what do you see? Well, you see something that looks like a rodent, and then you see all these intermediary steps, and then you land on a bat. But what do we actually find? Well, we don't find what this textbook shows. We don't find even a direct jump from a rodent to a bat. We just find bats. That's all. So where are the million years of transitions? They don't exist. Just look for yourself. They have a hypothetical ancestor walking around climbing on a tree, then slowly evolving these wings into 3 different species of bats, because we have the fruit bat, we have the insect-eating bat that has echolocation. They can't account for any of these things. What about fish? Well, just look for yourself. Again, we have the solid white line representing what we do have in the fossil record. Then we have that thin little tiny line, which is no fossil evidence. So yet again, without a doubt, what do we find? The exact same pattern we find every single time. The pattern reminiscent of creation, with no convergence going back to a common ancestor, no missing link common ancestors, nothing, except for the pattern that's reminiscent of creation yet again. Are you starting to see the pattern here, people? Where are all these missing links? They're all missing. Isn't that ironic? That they want to tell you this is one of their strongest assets for evolution is the fossil record, and it's that pathetic. What do we find? Exactly what we would expect to find in the fossil record. We find tracks before we ever find the bodies, because creatures were trying to outrun a global flood. I know that's a hard pill to swallow, evolutionists, but those are the facts. And the same thing goes for the dotted lines on this one. Look at all them. Just so we're clear, dotted lines indicate 0 evidence. Remove them, and what do you get? No transitional forms or evidence of gradual progression. A bat is a bat, a kangaroo stays a kangaroo, a horse stays a horse, of course. Unless, of course, the horse is Mr. Ed. Look, people, all I'm saying here is, if you've got facts, put them in there. If you don't, leave them out. And in summary, we agree with Mr. D. Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. Not then, not now, not ever. We have all been conned, everyone. We were duped into believing some bogus made-up concept, pushed because of an agenda, and not discovered by any actual science. Rather, retrofitted data based on an assumption that has been falsified time and time again, where the only truth actually found in it comes from biblical creationists Edward Blythe and Patrick Matthews that was plagiarized by Darwin, which is natural selection.
But I just don't understand. Why didn't God get creative and make us super unique? Like Yoda or something.
It wouldn't matter anyway, because even then, evolutionists would just say that Yoda evolved as well. So what about the fossil record? Can that be falsified easily? Yes, but let's get into specifics. Darwin predicted slow, gradual evolution over vast amounts of time, which became known as Darwinian gradualism. There should be no exceptions to this, since hundreds of millions of years are supposedly visible through these geologic layers representing large epochs of time. This prediction set the groundwork and foundation for the theory that is so popular today. So clearly, his prediction was correct for so many to believe it, right? I mean, there shouldn't even be a single out-of-place fossil if evolution is true. So let's test that theory and find out the truth, shall we? And right out the gate, we have organisms arising out of nowhere, fully formed, with no evolutionary precursor ancestor anywhere to be found. These are so common that they even have a name for them, and this is known as a ghost lineage, in which there is no fossil evidence prior. This is followed by, yet again, another complete contradiction, which is known as stasis. This is an oxymoron, by the way. Evolutionary, meaning change, and stasis, meaning no change. And this is where we get the term living fossils. It's just another total falsification and failure of the evolutionary theory. And stasis in the fossil record isn't even rare. It's not the exception, it's what we mostly find. Followed by, yet again, another complete contradiction, a Lazarus taxon. This comes from the biblical figure Lazarus. And this is where a species goes extinct and is missing in the fossil record for millions of years and then just shows back up again, completely unchanged. Then we have another complete contradiction, which is saltationism. This is a term that suggests evolution occurs primarily through large and abrupt changes, rather than slow, gradual accumulation of small changes over time. You know, basically the exact opposite of what they're trying to claim today, that macroevolution is just slow microevolutionary changes over eons of time. Basically, it's just another example in the long list of concepts that proves the theory to be just as plastic as any other made-up pseudoscience concept. that is outside the realm of even being able to be proved wrong, because they will just make up any story, no matter how contradictory or implausible, just to save it from disappearing. And this is followed by yet again another complete falsification, where completely unrelated organisms were found to share almost identical similarities. They invented convergent evolution as a rescue device for this problem. And this is again followed by, you guessed it, another falsification, and this one is known as de-evolution. This is where evolution goes backwards, and this is another complete disaster discovery for evolutionists because of Dollo's law of irreversibility, which says that evolution can only go in one direction. And then we have punctuated equilibrium. This is supposedly where something lived for millions of years basically unchanged and then drastically changed extremely fast over a short period of time. All of these are falsifications of slow Darwinian gradual change over eons of time. So let's pretend that you went to court and all you had to do was find a single piece of evidence to prove the prosecutor wrong. They're claiming that the fossil record shows a picture of true history of common ancestry over slow, vast amounts of time. Then you show them not one, not two, but 10 examples of physical pieces of evidence that prove that story wrong. What do you think the judge would do? You only needed one. It's a case-closed argument, and so is evolution based on the fossil record itself.
A succession of even very similar forms doesn't demand common descent. It could, in this case it does, instead point to a common designer. These guys, the engineers at Chevy. Intelligent agents are free to reuse things however they want. Just like I use the same password, FluffyBunny123, for everything I do online. So the question remains open, is homology due to common design or common descent? Because the argument was so central to Darwin's case, his followers eliminated the question by simply redefining the word from simple similarity to meaning similarity due to common ancestry. They baked Darwinism into the definition of the word. Homology now typically means similarity due to common ancestry. It's a clever way to end an argument if you can get away with it, but for anybody paying attention, it's a baldly circular one. Common ancestry because common ancestry.
We got a flag on the play, circular reasoning, illegal use of logic, 5-yard penalty, repeat the 4th grade.
Oh, come on, no serious biologist could possibly make that mistake. Nobody defines homology that way and then uses it as evidence for evolution. Come on, people couldn't possibly be that. No. The circular argumentation is still regularly used in high school, even college level textbooks, and many a YouTube video. The surprising thing is that many otherwise very smart people didn't realize this. However, more and more people are seeing the problem for what it is.
That brings us to our next one, which is, of course, the evolutionary bottleneck versus creation bottleneck, right? We would have to say that evolution tells us that there have been multiple bottlenecks through many eons of time, and that these small inbreeding populations have existed. The young Earth creation model says, no, God told us be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, which one of these is true? Because people love to mock us. They go, you guys are so ridiculous. You believe that all the animals were inbreeding and then all of a sudden they could populate the world. That's stupid. It's unseen. Humans can't inbreed without genetic problems. Oh, really? Okay, well, yes, that is true today. But who really has the problem here? Is the problem really a small group of people filling up the earth from a small population really quickly in one generation? Or is this hypothetical scenario of populations going into a bottleneck and then living in small populations over long periods of time? Which one makes more sense? You can't be inbreeding in small populations without massive amounts of health problems. Ours doesn't have that because you get an extensive growth of populations where mutations aren't going to be a problem, because eventually there's going to be cousins and then third cousins, and it's not going to be a big issue. It's when you're in these smaller populations that evolution says they existed over tens of thousands of years. That's the actual inbreeding problem. So I find it ironic that they say we have an inbreeding problem when they have the biggest inbreeding problem that there is. We have mutations building up from a perfect genome over a couple thousand years, a bottleneck, and then an explosion of people yet again. What happens in the animal kingdom? Can we prove that this scenario where they're mocking us again is true? Absolutely. How about when they dropped off wild mouflon sheep and on an island and they left them there? There were only a single pair of them. They can only inbreed. What happened? exactly the opposite of what evolution predicted could happen from two animals getting off the ark and filling up the world. They did just fine. They actually got to a population of 600 and there was no problem at all. The same thing with deer. They dropped off deer, five whitetail. I think only two of them, there was only a single male. Boom, they filled up. No problem with inbreeding at all. They filled up the entire area. How about the in Catalina when they dropped off buffalo? They dropped off like a handful of buffalo, like 14 of them or something, on this island for a movie. Yeah, they dropped off 14 of them, and they exploded to 600 of them. They were like, oh my gosh, they lowered them down to 150 because they were like, oh man, that's maintainable. We can't maintain 600 of them. They actually had to try to slow down the population growth. There is no problem with the creation model at all of putting in genetic diversity and then allowing animals to get off the ark and populate the world. There isn't. It's the same thing with human beings. Matter of fact, we know what Eve's sequence is. And you can read this by Dr. John Sanford when Andrew Snelling published this with him. And you can go and read that Eve's sequence has already been done. We already know what her genome looked like. And because we base everything on function, it's much easier to say. And then we have the creation, which makes more sense. We have the story of evolution, which doesn't make genetic sense. It doesn't make inbreeding sense. It doesn't make any sense, really. Everything should be different if evolution was true. But I digress. We see what creation sees. And we know that they're not objective when it comes to this because they have a prior commitment of materialism. They cannot allow a divine foot in the door in science because the second they start allowing this type of thing to be taught, evolution is through. And they don't want that. They have another thing. How about Darwin? Let's go back to him real quick. He predicted, based on evolution being true, that Darwinian finches would produce one new species every 3,000 years based on deep time, based on what he knew. Well, guess what? The exact opposite happened. They found that in 2 generations, literally a new species can form. That is exactly the opposite of what he thought would ever be found to be true. That's way too fast. So literally in 3.3 years, there's a new species of finch. So when we go over it, evolution says slow, creation says fast. What do we see? We see animals evolving way faster than they ever thought, ever predicted. And this is observable data. This isn't anything we just don't know. We can go down the list of different things that we know. New species are evolving in 2 generations. That is way too quick for evolution, but it explains why we have so many different species alive today. If speciation can happen in just 2 generations, it's no big deal at all, right? How about people go, we lost wisdom teeth. That's proving that evolution is true, right? I mean, it shows that we're evolving to the next stage. It's like, wait a minute, we're losing information. The jaws of people are actually shrinking. And we know that they're shrinking because the people in the wild today are easily testable. And we can take them and we can say, look at the Australian Aboriginals. Let's see what happens when we take them. We put them on a modern diet. The very next generation are showing that their teeth don't fit in their mouth and they are no longer having wisdom teeth. That is not deep time evolution. That is the genome protecting the body because it's designed to know how to do so. It knows if it grows wisdom teeth with already a shrinking mouth with teeth that don't fit, you're going to have horrible problems. We see this exact same thing in elephants today. Because if we look at the Moa-Zimbabwe civil war that arose, elephants were being mass slaughtered for their tusks. And remember, elephants have a generation time like humans, very high, one of the slowest reproducing mammals on Earth. And within just 2 generations, 98% of all female elephants never develop tusk. How do they know to do this? Or are they like thinking, wait a minute, if I don't grow my tusks, maybe they'll stop killing me? No, the design network kicked in that was like, you're being killed for this reason. It's almost like it was designed, wasn't it? To like protect the animal from being killed. And you're like, well, that's really good. That proves evolution. That's a very good mutation. Oh, really? Because it's lethal when the mutation gets into males. And males are dying left and right because when they get the mutation, they die. So only females can exist with the benefit. The males die immediately. So when we look at Aboriginals, people, guess what? They lived, when they migrated into Australia, it was extremely hot there, right? And so it was so hot that their body adapted to this heat extremely fast. The Central Australian Aborigines actually have the ability to withstand massive amounts of temperature. Their body stays 50% cooler than you and me, naturally. All because of a gene variant that they got that isn't in other even Aboriginals that don't live there. And that happened very, very quickly. But yet they want to tell us the Aboriginals have been there for 65,000 years. Well, if that was the case, then guess what? Humans would be a different species, wouldn't they? Because if animals are evolving into different species within literally a couple generations, how can you isolate a group of humans in an area for 65,000 years and then come along later and then reproduce with them? It would be physically impossible because of all the gene conversions and all the other problems that would arise from isolation from that amount of time. The only way to explain the ability to assimilate and to breed with Aboriginals is the young Earth creation timeline. So that is it. How about the Dairy Queen? This is showing us that when we look at Vikings in the past, we know how tall they were because we know when they lived and when they were buried and who they were. And literally 1,000 years ago, they were a different height. They weren't very tall people. But yet, when we look at Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, all of them have the same gene variant for height, which makes them extremely tall. That means that gene variant arose within literally like 100 generations and spread through all the people. How about snakes? They're losing their white stripes. Why? Because when pollution gets into their environment, melanin absorbs toxins. So when a toxin dumps into the ocean, literally in the lifespan of that snake, they start losing their stripes so that the melanin can absorb the toxins, and their offspring are born without stripes, and they never get the stripes back again. So again, we see loss of information. We see something that was already there being lost. And then we go over to islands and we see that beetles are losing their ability to fly, because what happens is when they come on a, like, let's say debris brings them to an ocean, and then they get off and they are out on a new island, the wind picks them off and blows them back into the ocean, and they end up dying. So what happens is natural selection goes, what's going on here? Why these things are dying? So it's, again, they're not saying, like, they're not choosing to not fly. They're just using that ability if they have it. So what happens is the olfactory sensors in their nose now don't allow them to smell flowers far away. So they don't want to fly. So now they just walk around everywhere. And after just a few generations, they are now not able to fly at all because there was no need for it, because they lost that ability to smell. Think about that. That is insane, right? So we're talking about built-in design, right? You guys might like that slide, but I got to move on because I'm running out of time. Plants, same thing. Rapid, 10 to 100 years, they're adapting. Very, very fast environments. Mutations are not random. It seems like they're piling up exactly where they were supposed to be to help the species, like they were built-in designed. It took 100 years for the insects to adopt to eating it again. This is the cherry plum tree. Let's play it real quick.
This is the black cherry, an American tree species that has spread invasively in Western Europe over the past century. And for a long time, people thought that this was because it doesn't have any native natural enemy. But when you look at herbarium records over the past century, you see that more and more insects have started feeding on the black cherry. And actually nowadays we found that there are more different species of insects eating from this tree than from the native bird cherry. We also found that some specialized insects have evolved, have changed genetically to adapt to this new food source. And we think that over time this may help to control the invasive character of the black cherry. You can read all about this research in our latest publication in the journal PeerJ.
So what's going on? Again, we have a tree species that never existed in a place being moved in, and now all of a sudden it's growing and the insects are adapting to eating it. Really good, right? Well, guess what? When they removed the trees, the insects weren't able to adapt to living back at the environment that they once lived in and able to eat from. Isn't that incredible? The very own food source that was their main one is now they're unable to eat it because they lost that genetic information. Very similar to the E. coli experiment with Linsky, right? They moved into a special environment, they adapted to it, and then when they tried to move them back to the original, they couldn't live there anymore. They lost genetic information, exactly what our model says. We say the same thing in butterflies, and we see the same thing in deer. We see the same thing in toads. We see the same thing in animals. We look everywhere. Guppies, lizards, mosquitoes, mice. evolution is happening extremely fast, you see. But this adaptation, they've stolen the word adaptation or any change to mean evolution, right? So therefore, if anything changes, oh, it's proof of evolution. No, it's not. Every one of these examples is literally contrary to what they thought and predicted, right? So what do we see? The genetic variance fitness indicates rapid contemporary adaptive radiation of evolution in wild animals. Are there any of these examples proof, though, that any of these other organisms are related in the past? So does that prove now that these flightless insects now were related to something else? How about fish, right? Freshwater fish are genetically adapted from ocean dwelling. That's weird, right? In just 120 years? Oh, man. Yeah, even faster than that if you actually read the data. How about birds evolved virtually overnight to keep up with invasive prey? Wait a minute, that's too fast. How about the cliff swallows? Everyone's been driving down the freeway probably at some point and seeing these birds living in freeways. And yet, they've only started doing this recently. And as they've done this, they have actually shortened their wingspan, because larger wingspans actually are required for them to glide at a different rate. A smaller wing is more aerodynamic and allows them to turn quicker. But within just a few generations, what do we see? These birds have adapted to living under freeway overpasses really just that quickly. That's way too fast for evolution to be true. And how many bird families are there? 249. To me, that's how many would have been on the ark. And then the amount of species today. How about cat breeds? Well, wild cats, there's not very many of, but in breeds, there's tons of them. So we see the genetic diversity going on inside of wild animals, and we see the limit to what evolution would be able to produce. And it's not that much, guys. So how about rapid evolution in kinds?
Camels and llamas, so different and living on different continents, yet able to breed together and produce young. Examples abound of species that can be bred together. Zebras with horses, tigers with lions, potatoes with hot peppers, and so on. This amazes biologists. Based on modern rates of change, new species should quickly lose their ability to interbreed with other species. So, modern species that interbreed must have formed recently and rapidly. It's amazing that camels and llamas, though separated by oceans and thousands of miles, came from the same parents in relatively recent times. Then we could understand how a single pair of cats could produce all known cats. Today, crossbreeding between domestic cats and wild cats, between cougars and leopards, between lions and tigers indicate that all modern cat species are the same created kind. The original cat kind carried all the information necessary to build the variety of cats we see today. So how could such major changes have arisen so rapidly? This is a mystery to biologists.
Squids are shrinking. Birds are migrating. Lizards are getting blown away by hurricanes. The signs are everywhere. Animals are changing.
But few people expected it to happen so fast.
About 2,500 miles away, a series of marine heat waves swept through the Gulf of California, warming the surface temperature of the water and impacting various species, including the Humboldt squid.
Humboldt squid are also known as jumbo squid because they grow so large. They can be 3, 4, 5, even 6 feet in length. Fishers in the Gulf of California were the first people to notice that something had changed when they stopped catching the Humboldt squid. When the scientists arrived to study this situation, they found that, in fact, the Humboldt squid were still there and in some places more plentiful than before. What had changed was their lifestyle and their body. These were not immature or juvenile squid. They were Humboldt squid at full size, reproducing and carrying out their lives in half the time they used to.
Dr. William Gilly and his team measured the squid they caught and found a reduction of 50% or more in their body size in response to the stress of the higher water temperatures. This adaptation is known as plasticity.
Plasticity is already built into the genome of a species. It's already there.
From the warm waters of Mexico, we travel to the frigid north to study another example of plasticity, behavioral plasticity, in the feeding patterns of this Arctic bird.
I think we're all familiar with that iconic climate change image of the polar bear stranded on a shrinking iceberg. But if you could look beyond the bear to the edge of the ice, you might catch a glimpse of a tiny seabird called the little auk or dovekey. Dovekies feed along the edge of the ice floes where there are a lot of plankton, and that has been their strategy for thousands of years. It worked just fine until the ice floes began to shrink and retreat farther and farther from the islands where the dovekies breed. And you can imagine, as that ice gets farther and farther away, the dovekies have longer and longer to travel to reach a place where they can get food for their offspring. And they have long been predicted to be an early casualty of climate change.
French scientist David Grimley and his team placed transmitters on the birds and wondered how long they would need to fly to their usual plankton meal, which was now far away at the edge of the retreating ice.
So when they gathered around to collect the first batch of data from their transmitters, they were astounded, because instead of flying an hour, the dovekies had been in the air for less than 4 minutes. David and his team realized that the dovekies had found a new food source right on their very doorstep. At the mouth of the fjord, where the milky blue meltwater from island glaciers was slamming into the dark, cold currents of the Arctic Ocean and creating this place of plenty for the dovekies to feed upon the stunned plankton.
The dovekies continue to thrive by being flexible enough as a species to switch up their traditional feeding patterns and adapt quickly to a changing environment.
Plants and animals all over the world adapting their behaviors, sometimes changing their bodies, sometimes even evolving in response to climate change. We can take inspiration from plants and animals in terms of our own response to the crisis. After all, if a tiny lizard can evolve in response to climate change, then it stands to reason we can change some of the behaviors that are bringing it about.
Just so many examples, time and time again, of this rapid adaptation that was never predicted by evolution. And so we've run out of time, I guess. So I'm going to have to skip junk DNA, mutation, saturation, longevity, genetic potential, vestigial organs, leftover remnants. We're going to have to stop on chromosome 2 fusion, races. But one thing that I do want to finish up is predictions. And we have 3 novel predictions that are going to be made right now tonight that I'm going to break down real quick. We are going to say that ancient mummified Egyptians, animals and people, are going to have fewer mutations than people alive today, going back and making predictive power based on the young Earth creation timeline. Meaning, if evolution is true, they wouldn't really have very many mutations different than us today, because obviously, they only lived a few thousand years ago, so not a lot of mutations will be there. But in our model, it was this is almost 4,000 years ago, right? So they're going to have a lot of mutation differences from us. Another one is ERV knockout prediction, the more beneficial than not, and fewer orphan genes in Africans and the Khoisan people. And the reason why is because if we're going to make predictions based on these things, if we see going backwards, ERVs we're going to say have function, and these functions are going to be more beneficial than the detriment that they actually bring. And as far as orphan genes, we know that on a study that was done with flies, where we forced them into reproductive isolation, and we took younger species, our flies, and we forced them to breed and produce offspring, they eventually lost their orphan genes. So that would mean then, if Nathaniel Jensen is right, then what we would do is Africans are actually reproducing at younger rates, then therefore they should have less orphan genes within them as a human population. It only makes sense, right? The only caveat with that would be is that the fruit fly study was done on flies that were very adolescent. I'm not sure around puberty age, so I'll have to check that one out. But regardless, what that would mean is that if Africans have less orphan genes, it'll show that human beings didn't come from Africans. It would mean that we branched off with them. So it would clarify multiple things of our model. So Again, if we're wrapping this all up, we explain genetic diversity better, we explain genetic similarity better, we explain mutation rates better, we explain human origins better, we explain phenotypic diversity better, the fossil record better, bottlenecks, human migration, inbreeding, population growth, history, junk DNA, disease better, vestigial organs, we make better testable predictions. So when I see clowns like, other people, atheists over here just saying, I don't see any evidence at all, they're just looking through the lens of what they want to already believe to be true.
Today, I'm going to show you one more piece of evidence that totally falsifies evolution, yet again, and how our model far better explains the data. You see, there are two major views when it comes to answering the diversity of life question: young Earth creation and deep time evolution. We both have the exact same evidence, but view them entirely different. So I ask you to set aside emotion and just look at the data, what it shows, and make up your own mind based on the evidence and nothing else. I am going to show you why our view of the past is far better than evolution, and how it not only better answers what we see, but solves the paradoxes that evolution theory runs into. Let me break it down for you this way. When we look into the mitochondria, we go to a specific region called the CO1 gene compartment, also known as cytochrome C. We find that the region is highly conserved, but still accrues mutations rather quickly. When mutations do arise, they do not always mutate in the same spot. This is really good, because it allows us to know what sequences have mutated and which ones have not. Therefore, we can know exactly what are mutations and what are not mutations, so we know what the original sequence looked like. So, how does all this fit together? Well, it comes down to predictions. It was Nathaniel Jensen who predicted that if we looked in the mitochondria, that we would find nowhere near the amount of mutations expected if 7 million years of time had passed. That was predicted in 2015 and published in 2017 in his book Replacing Darwin. So the predictions were laid out and in print. Now it was time to test which model made the best prediction. Over time, mutations build up in the mitochondria. If deep time evolution is true, then we would expect to find the mitochondria completely saturated in mutations. If young Earth creation is true, then we would only find a few mutations. This is based on how fast the mutation rate in this region is, and we would expect to find 21,457 mutations would have built up in this region over that amount of time. This means we should find complete mutation saturation of 12,000 mutations in the mitochondria. We are not even remotely close to equilibrium. I decided to run these same numbers on a highly conserved region of the mitochondria called the CO1 gene, and I got the exact same results. Nowhere near the amount of mutations have occurred and nowhere near mutation saturation. We find a fast mutation rate and few mutations. This can only mean one thing: young Earth creation is true, and the genetic evidence supports this. This was discovered in 2018 in the Rockefeller University study that showed clear genetic boundaries. And in that same study, we noticed when we look at humans, we find up to 10 mutations have occurred in this region in some people. When we look at chimpanzees, we find the average is about 65 mutations. So now, let's use the evolutionary timeline and take that back. Not just 200,000 years, when they believe that there was a global ice age that caused a bottleneck to occur, but let's keep going, back 6 to 7 million years, to this elusive split between the human and chimpanzee line. Look at how many mutations would have occurred over that vast amount of time. There's plenty of time for there to be tons of differences between us and them, yet there are so few. They have even admitted that this paradox is perplexing to them. We can read it right here. Unlike our closest genetic relatives, chimps, all humans have virtually identical DNA. In fact, one group of chimps can be more genetically diverse than all 6 billion humans alive today. It is thought we split from a common ancestor with chimpanzees 5 to 6 million years ago, which is more than enough time for substantial genetic differences to develop. So why haven't they? Well, if young Earth creation is true, we would have God creating a fully functional mitochondria, and just a few thousand years until the flood, and just 5,000 years or so until current day. So what makes more sense with the data? it should be obvious. But because evolution is not allowed to view history through the biblical lens of creation, they will never solve their paradox. And this is just one in the long line of problems with evolution theory, and they will never be able to solve it.
The evolutionary community even admits that this discovery confounds the prediction made that we should see much more genetic diversity, yet we don't. How have evolutionists tried to deal with and explain this destructive evidence that's against them? Well, it has been ignored overall, with the exception of an atheist blogger who goes by Evograd, and one of the biggest critics of Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's work. After reading his critique, he literally had nothing to save the science. He actually admits that there is far too many differences compared to what we observe. This is why he wrote an entire essay dedicated to both griping about Dr. Nathaniel Jensen's chart showing 21,457 mutations as where we can only see 12,000 mutations, and how often these mutations occur regarding a particular position. This is how desperate they are. Not only did he miss the entire point of why Jensen put those numbers on the chart to begin with, because it is not that we should see that many mutations, it is the fact that Jensen says that many mutations total should have occurred over that amount of time, and that it is clear that we would find mutation saturation, not that we would find 21,457 mutations when looking at the mitochondria. This is what you get when you have critics who are emotionally responding to something because they are dead set against it. Overall, he ignores the actual problems and hand waves the topic away altogether because of the fact that it is yet again another failed prediction and falsification of evolution. His goal clearly was trying to make everyone reading focus on both Jensen as a person and not the argument itself. This is why he did not answer it, because it cannot be answered in the evolutionary community. As they begrudgingly admit, evolution is unfalsifiable nonsense that is so plastic it can use any evidence for it, and nothing discovered will ever be good enough to falsify it because it's complete pseudoscience. This is why schools teach so little evolutionary science, because it is known as a soft science, all based on hypothetical assumptions about the past using historical science rather than observational. And they even admit that over the last 100 years, biology itself has progressed without any help from evolution theory. None of the fields from molecular biology, biochemistry, physiology don't even take evolution into account at all. Evolution theory really is the origin of nonsense. It holds back actual progress in many fields, and this is why the NIH, or the National Institute of Health, the largest health organization on Earth, uses the biblical young Earth creation model called Mendel's accountant, created by young Earth creationists Dr. John Sanford, Robert Carter, and John Baumgartner. If evolution was true, why would they not use some evolutionary program based on the rate of mutation effects and proliferation spreading through a population over deep evolutionary time? Instead, they used the rate of fast mutation spread through the population, which was predicted by us young Earth creationists. They clearly do not care about the creation versus evolution debate. They just care about what works, and what works is the biblical creation model.
We know that Denisovan, Neanderthal, and modern-day man all met one another and interacted. Therefore, that immediately rules out interacting with them before a bottleneck, because, according to evolution, modern humans didn't even exist to interact with. Therefore, we have the smoking gun refuting evolution, and that all of these people were just living together at the same time, and mutation rates show us that there is no possible way that they could have lived before the bottleneck, since they were all on the same side of the bottleneck together, and mutations all line up and take us right back to the same bottleneck together. Now we know that the high amount of mutation accumulation that we see in us and them had to all take place after the bottleneck. And this fits perfectly with what we've been saying all along, based on what we know about isolation, divergence, and population size. So the genetic boundary already existed at the bottleneck. It is the boundary of the genetic differences that separate different kinds. This boundary cannot be bridged by just assuming common ancestry is true and using imagination to bridge these gaps and go back in time before a bottleneck.
then presume something that we've never seen happen today happened back then, such as a common ancestor splitting into different animal families. Believing a split between humans and chimps happened is fine, but it's faith-based and without evidence. As I stated earlier, that if it were true, there would be far more differences if this split actually happened in the deep past. We just don't see that. Nor do we see this convergence in the deep past with any of these so-called splits. Take Miacids, for example, which supposedly split into dogs, bears, cats, mongoose, skunks, otters, badgers, raccoons, hyenas, weasels, polecats, and even aquatic walruses and seals. The genetic convergence doesn't exist for any of these. There is no evidence for it, and there never will be. Do not be deceived. So again, even if this evolutionary scenario of common ancestry was true, there would be no way of proving it, since there is no possible way to connect ancestry to anything past a bottleneck event. And even they were forced to admit that a global bottleneck genetic reset had to have occurred. So they are stuck ever being able to prove common ancestry because of it. So they had to save their dying theory by invoking something else that also destroys their theory. That's evolution for you. So, what has genetic testing using DNA barcoding exposed in the last 5 years? Well, it has validated the young Earth creation position of independent lines of ancestry with genetic boundaries that should not exist if evolution was true. It also confirms scripture, which states that a global bottleneck happened, even killing the aquatic life on Earth. Evolution never predicted this, and originally stated it did not happen. When the undeniable genetic evidence finally confirmed that it did, they went looking in their own made-up fossil record created by an atheist with an agenda, and they found nothing. The absence of transitional fossils that should be everywhere in the fossil record, if it was true, is another telltale sign that the story is another myth based on imagination and lies. We see fast mutation rates, low genetic diversity, independent lines of ancestry with genetic boundaries, and biological evidence of a global bottleneck inside of all life on Earth. All of this only points to one conclusion: the young Earth creation biblical model of ancestry. There's no way around it. So the case for independent origins versus common ancestry is really a dead issue. The sad part is that people think evolution is science, and it's not. It's anti-science, because it doesn't allow competing theories. It is also unfalsifiable. It also doesn't make predictions, even on mutations which the theory is based on. And it can't even predict what anything is going to evolve into because the theory is so plastic that they will just say, well, anything can happen. The only reason it hangs on is because it's protected by law. It's sad that kids will only hear one side of a horrible argument, the side that is nothing but a made-up lie invented for an agenda that tells them that they are related to the very strawberry that they are eating for lunch. Imagine that.
There's a reason intelligent design isn't taught in our learning institutions. The legal staff of Freedom from Religion Foundation, a church-state watchdog group, has had remarkable success in convincing many institutions, such as school boards and town councils, that they are breaking constitutional law when they sponsor sectarian activities. That includes intelligent design. When the authorities can't be convinced, Freedom from Religion Foundation sues, and it wins more often than not.
If you want your kids to learn real science and want to get young Earth creation taught at your local school, then look no further than Curriculum in Crisis. My book was created for one reason and one reason only: to get your local public school to teach a better model than evolution, one that better explains the genetic diversity of life we see on Earth today. This book will teach you how and why it's so important to get biblical creation into your local public schools so kids do not grow up believing a lie that ruins their minds forever.